Today, I'm going to share two stories about people who found themselves in truly just hopeless situations. And in both of these stories, the main character makes a very unexpected decision that completely changes their lives, for better or for worse. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please surprise the follow button with a brand new wireless controller for their gaming console. But don't tell them it's really just their old controller that you cut the wire off of. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Homesick. One night in late August of 1557, a Frenchman in his 30s named Martin Guerre was laying in a bed in a makeshift military hospital in St. Quentin, France, writhing around in pain. So a few weeks earlier, Martin had fought in this massive battle between the French and Spanish armies. And it had been this just horrible, bloody, violent battle. And during it, Martin had been wounded very severely. In fact, he had lost his leg. Now, this injury was obviously just devastating and very painful, but Martin also knew he was just lucky to be alive here. The doctors who had treated him at one point had seemed certain that he was going to die. So Martin and his doctors were all very surprised when he didn't die and he pulled through and survived. And Martin knew that a lot of his comrades who'd already left St. Quentin by this point and moved on with the army or gone back home, they very likely thought that he had died, given how bad it looked. But he was alive and in a lot of pain. And really more than that, he was just sort of devastated. I mean, he was incredibly lonely. All of his army mates had basically left the hospital or just moved on with their careers or they'd gone home. And he was still here, unable to leave the hospital. And he has this injury too. He hasn't really gotten used to life without the use of his leg. And so his whole world has come crashing down. He's sort of by himself. All he has is the few army doctors who periodically come over and check on him. But beyond those people, he was just isolated and sort of trapped with these awful thoughts in his head 24/7. And eventually, these spiraling thoughts became really like the worst thing he was dealing with. They surpassed the actual physical pain he was dealing with. It was just this incredible depression that had set in. So Martin, he had grown up in this small rural village in southern France called Artigas. And he had gotten married at a very young age to a woman named Bertrand, and they had loved each other very much, and they had a son together. However, Martin had sort of completely messed up his life when he stole some grain from his father and had to literally flee town. Stealing, especially from a family member at the time, was not only criminal, but really quite shameful. And Martin had been so afraid of what people would say and what they would think of him that he decided not to face them at all. And he just left Artigas, leaving behind Bertrand and his son and his whole life. Now, initially, after he had sort of run away, he had considered going back and just saying he was sorry and accepting whatever punishment he'd be given. But he was always too scared to do it, and so he just didn't. And then before long, he got caught up in this war, and then years had passed by. It's like he's basically just gone. He's been removed from Bertrand and his son's life. He's just out of their lives. He's left them. And now, he's had his leg blown off. And in his mind, in this depressed state he was in, now, he had never really stopped thinking about his former life. He missed his wife terribly, but he's thinking to himself, I'm not the person she married. I'm a different person. I'm a degraded, bad person. She wouldn't even want to be with me at this point. And then beyond Bertrand and his son, and how they would look at him, he also was thinking that he was this thief, this shameful person that the rest of the village would not welcome back. So in his mind, he really felt not just isolated in this hospital, with no army mates nearby, stuck because of this injury, but he's also thinking, I don't even have a place in the world. I have nothing. My life is ruined. And so as Martin lay in the hospital bed, having these horrible thoughts and feeling all this physical pain in his leg, just having this horrible time, he found his mind wandering to somebody else in his life that had been very important to him, his friend Arnaud. He just wished if there was one person that he could talk to right now, it would be him. So Arnaud was a fellow soldier, and before this really horrible battle where Martin lost his leg, the two had been great friends and they bonded because they had a lot in common. They were both from small towns in the south of France, and they even looked the same, like they could pass as brothers. So they'd gotten really close and they talked about their lives and they shared a lot with one another. But like everyone else in the military that Martin had been friendly with or just worked with, Arnaud had, moved on. He was no longer here. He had gone somewhere else, wherever the army sent him. And so Arnaud was just yet another person in his life who he wished he could spend more time with, but knew he wouldn't. And so Martin's recovery would take a very long time. He was stuck in a hospital, basically bedridden with these horrible thoughts and this awful pain for weeks and then months, and then years passed by, and Martin still was just a shell of himself. And so he actually was moved to hospice care. However, after getting to hospice, Martin actually didn't die. Like typically hospice care is for people that are at the end of life and that no longer is it about trying to save them, it's about keeping them comfortable until they pass away. But for Martin, he didn't die. He actually got better. And one afternoon in early September of 1560, so now about 3 years or so after he had lost his leg, Martin sat on a bench outside of the hospice that he had been staying in since the war had ended. Now, where he was located was actually just, a few miles from his hometown, Artigas. But despite the now close proximity to, his former life, if you will, to Martin, it felt like, Artigas could have been a million miles away. It couldn't have felt further away for him. So after Martin sort of miraculously healed inside of hospice care and he was outfitted with a wooden prosthetic leg and was told that he could now leave and go about his life, well, it was good on the one hand. He got to go, back into reality, but he still had a lot of health problems as a result of his injuries. And, given this treacherous stretch of time where he had just been stuck in bed having these horrible thoughts, he had completely convinced himself that truly he was like a shell of the man he used to be, and that nobody from his previous life would want him, not his wife, not his son, not anybody. Like he was nothing now. And so even though Martin was better at this point, in his mind, he sort of had resigned himself to simply wasting away and dying all alone. He just figured, even though the doctors say I'm better, that's the path I'm on, and I'm not going to change it. But now, as Martin sat outside on this bench, he heard a voice. And when he looked over at the road in front of the hospice where he heard this voice, he saw there was a man that he had never met before who was clearly walking towards him, like that was the person speaking to him. As the man approached Martin, he asked him, "Are you Martin Guerre?" And when Martin slowly nodded, saying, "Yes, I am," this man's face lit up, and he explained that he'd been looking all over for him. He said he'd been sent here on behalf of Martin's family back in Artigas, and he wanted to bring Martin back to them. When Martin heard this, he couldn't believe it. I mean, he really was so convinced that he was just destined for a life of shame and agony until he died. And now to hear that his family wants him back, they're looking for him, this was incredible. This was unbelievable. I mean, he really assumed he would never go home again. And now here was this guy saying, "Come with me, let's go home." However, before Martin could ask any follow-up questions, of which he had many, like about his family and what they asked about him, that kind of thing, the man told Martin that actually he had been sent here to get Martin and he was going to bring him home, but first they needed to stop at the courthouse in a city called Toulouse. Martin looked at him like, "What do you mean?" And the man explained the reason behind it. And Martin simply couldn't believe what he was being told. A few days later, on the morning of September 12th, Martin climbed out of a wagon in front of the courthouse in Toulouse, a city about 40 miles away from Artigas. And Martin, he felt butterflies in his stomach as he, used his cane to climb the court steps to get up to the front doors. And then when he got up there, he took a deep breath, threw open the double doors, and stepped inside. And the instant he did, the first thing he saw is the entire courthouse was filled with people, and they all turned to look at him, and everyone's speaking with these hushed voices like, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe it." And that's when Martin realized he had just walked directly in to the middle of a trial. And so Martin, for a second, he just stood there staring back at all these people who were turned to look at him, and he realized that he recognized many of their faces. He saw some of his friends, he saw his Uncle Pierre, and some of his sisters. He saw his wife, Bertrande, as well as a boy sitting next to her. who must have been his son. And all of these people, they're looking at Martin with just looks of absolute shock on their faces. Like they were completely stunned to see him, and they're all looking at his wooden leg, and they're looking back at him. It was like they couldn't believe he had just walked in here. However, before Martin could really, fully appreciate the emotional moment he was having here, seeing his loved ones after over a decade, he first looked towards the front of the courthouse. And as soon as Martin saw what was up there, he knew that what that man had told him, who came up to him on the bench in front of the hospice, was true. And Martin had to bite his lip to keep from screaming. It would turn out Martin was wrong to believe that, his wife and the town of Artigas would never accept him back, that he was worthless and should never return. Because his wife Bertrande and the town of Artigas actually did welcome him back. Or so they thought. Because when Martin walked into that courthouse and looked towards the front of the room, what he saw was his long-lost buddy Arnaud from the war. And Arnaud was on trial. Arnaud did not just look like he could be Martin's brother. He looked exactly like Martin. And since Arnaud really had been very disliked in his own hometown for being a con artist, he wanted a fresh start in a new place after he left the army. So, years earlier, while Martin was lying in a makeshift army hospital so badly injured that doctors were telling him he was almost certainly going to die, while that was happening, his best bud, Arnaud, was using their likeness and his knowledge of Martin's life from all the times that Martin had confided in his friend to literally steal Martin's life. Arnaud had waltzed into Artigas and told everyone there that he was Martin Guerre. And the entire town not only believed him, they celebrated his return. Arnaud was actually so convincing that even Bertrande had believed Arnaud was her husband, and she had gone on to have 2 additional children with him, believing this was Martin. However, one person, Martin's uncle, Pierre, he just didn't buy it. He thought this guy was a fake. He thought he was an imposter, and he took him to court for fraud. And that trial was why the man had tracked Martin down at the hospice and brought him to Toulouse to help prove to everyone there that, look, Arnaud's an imposter because here's the real Martin. And of course, it worked, because when Martin stepped into that courtroom and his own family laid eyes on him, the actual Martin Guerre, they realized right away that Arnaud truly was a fake. Arnaud was ultimately sentenced to death and hanged in front of Martin's house in Artigas while the entire village watched. As for Bertrande, Martin's wife, she was horrified to learn that she had not recognized her own husband and that she had had 2 kids with a stranger. She begged Martin to forgive her, but he never did. Our second and final story today is called Layers. One morning in November of 1940, an 84-year-old prospector named Erwin Robertson hiked down a snowy ridge in the Alaskan wilderness. He was pushing this sled that was full of supplies and animal furs, and it was pretty hard. As he was pushing this thing along, he was working so hard that he was breathing really heavy, and even though it was really cold outside, he could feel himself sweating underneath his clothes, like he was going to be covered in sweat. Now, Erwin knew that what he was doing was, risky. After all, he certainly was not as young as he used to be, and you don't want to get hurt out here or, totally exhaust yourself out here. This is the wild. But Erwin was not about to slow down because he could just not wait to get home. So Erwin had come to this area about 40 years earlier as part of the big Alaskan gold rush. And so, like basically every other prospector, he spent every summer and every fall at a cabin up in the mountains, predominantly hunting and mining. But his real home, where he really considered where he lived, was in the pioneer town of Eagle, Alaska, where he lived during the winter and the spring. And that is where Erwin was headed this morning. He had just wrapped up a very successful fall season up in the mountains, and he'd actually intended on staying in the cabin up in the mountains a bit longer. But a few days ago, the temperature had suddenly dropped, and Irwin did not have the supplies to wait out a winter storm up in that cabin. So he had packed up his things, told the handful of other prospectors in the area where he was going, and then he set out for Eagle. Now, this was a 100-mile trek to get to his home in Eagle, and it was through some very rough terrain, and also he's in Alaska, so this is like a very rough area to be navigating. But Irwin had made the trip at least once a year for the past 4 decades, so he knew what he was doing. So, despite really exerting himself here pushing the sled, he kept up as hard of a pace as he could manage for the next couple of hours, and then finally, around midday, he allowed himself to slow down and just take a quick break. However, after stopping and reaching into his parka and pulling out his canteen to take a sip of water, as he's sipping the canteen, something catches his attention out of the corner of his eye. And even though all he saw was just like a flash of movement out in the trees, he knew immediately what it was. So during this trek so far, there was this pack of wolves that was following him. He knew they were following him. But again, this is a man who lived in the wilds of Alaska, and so he was not unaccustomed to running into packs of wolves. He knew they were quite dangerous, especially for a guy who's alone in the woods right now. But he wasn't that concerned. However, he's thinking, okay, they're right over there. I'm going to take a very quick break. He, capped his canteen, put it back in his parka, and he's like, I'm going to keep on moving here. A few hours later, Irwin was a good ways further down the ridge, but he was starting to get cold. In fact, ice had formed on his beard and on his eyelashes. So the temperature had dropped much faster than he had expected, and he was starting to get worried because he knew it was only going to get much worse after the sun went down. And remember, he's been exerting himself this whole time. He's been sweating under his clothes, so he's wet under his clothes. And now the temperature's dropping, so he's like getting really, really cold. And so he decided that it was in his best interest to actually just stop right now and build a fire and just make sure he was warm. And so Irwin, he continued pushing his sled, keeping his eyes peeled for a good spot to actually stop and make camp. But as he's moving along, he hears something that causes him to just stop. It wasn't the sound of wolves. It was the sound of trickling water. And much like the wolves, water was quite dangerous out in the wilds of Alaska. But in many ways, water, especially in a very cold environment like this, was like the most lethal to people. Because getting fully wet in these temperatures basically guaranteed you would freeze to death. So Irwin moved very cautiously forward because, again, all he can do is hear the trickling water. He doesn't know where it is, and he's thinking, I better be careful I don't accidentally step into a creek or something and get wet here. He's already wet from sweating underneath his clothes. He can't afford to get more wet, and so he's moving carefully and cautiously. And then he rounds a bend, and he actually sees the source of the sound. It was a creek that had basically completely frozen over, with the exception of a little bit of water that was sort of leaking out and sort of spilling out over the ice itself. And over time, this water that was making the sound and leaking out, it was sort of freezing in layers on the surface of this creek. And so it was kind of like this, moundy block of ice that was sitting on top of this creek, but you could clearly see water sort of trickling its way through it. And so when Irwin saw this, he realized that, as long as he was very careful to avoid stepping on the frozen creek itself, that this area would actually make a great spot to spend the night. He could refill his canteen from the little spout of water coming out of the creek. Plus, there were a bunch of dead trees nearby, which were perfect for firewood. And this was good news, because by this point, Irwin was so cold he was shivering. So he parked his sled and then began gathering up some firewood. But as he was going around doing this, he spotted a few of those wolves who had not stopped following him, not very far away from him. They were sort of lingering in the trees, clearly watching him. And for the first time, Irwin started to feel pretty anxious about these wolves. The fact that they were now even closer than the last time he saw them suggested that, one, they're still following him, but two, they're getting braver, they're getting closer. But Irwin's thinking, I can't just continue on here. As much as it makes sense to get away from the wolves, I'm beat physically and I'm soaked. My clothes are wet. I'm getting so cold. I'm going to die of hypothermia if I'm not careful. I got to start this fire. I have to make camp here. I just have to. About 20 minutes later, Irwin had gathered up all the wood that he would need, and he piled it all next to his sled, and then he got ready to start his fire. And in this kind of very cold environment, actually starting the fire, the process of igniting the fire, was a potentially very dangerous process. because in order to light the match, to light the fire, Erwin would have to take off his mittens and expose his hands to the freezing cold. But Erwin had to do it, so he reached down and he bit one of his mittens and pulled it off with his teeth, and then with that hand he reached into his parka and he pulled out his fire kit, which contained these thin scraps of tinder that he would use as fire-starting material. Then he grabbed a match and he struck it to light it, but it didn't catch, like the head of the match did not catch on fire. And so Erwin tried again, striking the match once more, but it didn't light, and again he just kept trying over and over, and eventually he just snapped the match in half. Now, Erwin didn't panic, because he knew that, in extreme cold, some matches light better than others, and some don't even light at all, and he had seen this happen before, so he wasn't panicking. Instead, he pulled off his other mitten to make sure he had max dexterity here, and he took out the other match, and he held the thing he was striking it against, and he struck the second match, thinking this one will light. But it didn't, and he tried again and again, and he's starting to get a little panicked when finally he strikes the match, and this one does catch. But by this point, he's now had his naked hands exposed to the unbelievably cold temperatures for over a minute, and his hands were like starting to seize up from the cold. They were shaking, in fact, so badly from the cold that even though he's got this light, his hands shook so much that by the time he transferred it to the tinder, the shaking caused it to extinguish. It was out. And at this point, Erwin did start to panic because his hands are in so much pain and they're so stiff from the cold that he was afraid that even if he put his mittens back on his hands, they wouldn't warm up fast enough for him to then remove his mitten and try this whole fire thing again. He really needed the fire in order to warm his hands, but obviously he needs his hands to make the fire. And so he's got a problem here. So Erwin, who was not one to give up easily, he just gritted his teeth, and with his, failing hands, he just reached down and, fumbled and grabbed a third match, thinking, I gotta light this one, I gotta start this fire to warm my hands up, to warm my whole body up, I gotta do this. And so he's got this third match, he's barely able to hold it, and it took all his focus just not to drop it, but finally he managed to scrape it against the side of this matchbook, and to his relief, it did catch. And so immediately Erwin, very carefully, kind of sheltered this little flame, and he carried it over to the tinder, and he put the flame on the tinder, but nothing happened. Erwin waited for the bundle to catch fire, but it didn't. And then the flame, the match, just burned out. And for a long moment, Erwin just stared at this scene in front of him in confusion. He didn't understand, because he knew that this time he had done it all right. He had lit the match, he put it on the tinder, he had done this so many times before, but it's just not working. But then he looked more closely at the tinder, and his heart just sank, because he knew that the situation he was in was truly catastrophic. Several days later, there were some people living in Eagle, Alaska, who noticed that Erwin was not in Eagle. He had not arrived. And it didn't make any sense because he had told people when he would be there, and there was no reason he would be late unless something happened. And so these folks were just concerned enough that they went to authorities, and by November 19th, which is almost exactly a week after Erwin had struggled to light that fire, the U.S. Marshal's Office was out in force looking for Erwin. And so on November 19th, a deputy from the U.S. Marshal's Office who was out in the wilderness, a part of this search, he and his team came through these trees and he saw this clearing up ahead, and he noticed there was something in the middle of it. It was a sled that was surrounded by supplies, and it was set up on the bank of a frozen creek. And so immediately the deputy thought, this could be Erwin's sled. He could be nearby. And so he and his men, they rush down to this sled and they look around and they see there's a rifle propped up against a tree, and there's this stack of unused firewood, and there's all this tinder and a bunch of matches that are strewn about on the ground that also don't appear to have been used. But beyond these supplies and these things they're seeing, there was nothing else. Erwin was not here. However, the longer the deputy stood there just looking around, the more he realized what actually must have happened to Erwin. Because after sort of doing an initial scan, he realized there was something else in this clearing that he hadn't noticed at first. Wolf tracks. The deputy told his men that, very likely Erwin has been killed and carried off by wolves here, so follow these tracks and see if we can recover Erwin's body. And so the search party set out to go look. However, pretty quickly, they realized that, as they're following these tracks, that something just seemed off here. It seemed obvious given that Irwin had not shown up yet. He's been found, his stuff's all here, he's not here, and there's these tracks here. It seemed obvious that he must have been killed by wolves, but they don't see any blood anywhere. Like, wouldn't he have been attacked by his stuff? And there'd be signs of an attack, and then he's been dragged off. There should be a trail of blood or something. Any indication that a struggle happened, but no, it was just tracks, nothing else. And so eventually, as the deputy and his men are just following these tracks sort of farther and farther away from the sled and what they had found near the creek, they stopped and they're like, hold on a minute, something doesn't add up here. Let's go back and take another look at the actual site where the sled was, because again, there's no evidence of an actual wolf attack. There's just evidence of wolves. And so they turn around and they follow the wolf tracks back to where the sled is, and they start looking around more closely for, maybe there is some sign of a wolf attack that they missed, and they're looking around, and they eventually spot what appear to be Irwin's tracks. And they began following these, thinking that, maybe Irwin had become hypothermic and confused and wandered off into the woods, and either he died out there or had been attacked out there by wolves, but let's follow these, and this is bound to lead us to wherever Irwin went. But the footprints, they only led away from the sled a few feet before doubling back and stopping right at the edge of this frozen creek. And so for a minute, the deputy's looking down, trying to make sense of how these tracks just stop right here. Did they miss something? Where did Irwin go? But then the deputy just literally looked at the creek, towards the center of this frozen creek, which to that point he hadn't really been focusing on. It was all the things on the land. Now he's looking at the creek itself, and suddenly he knew what happened to Irwin. So a week earlier, on the night that Irwin is trying to start this fire, he's desperate, he's becoming hypothermic, the wolves are nearby, he finally strikes that third match, he gets it to light, but the tinder won't light, because the tinder was wet. We can assume the reason it was wet is because he kept his fire kit inside of his parka, and he was working so hard with that sled, he was sweating so much that he sweat on the tinder, and he soaked it. And so now he does not have a way to start a fire. He cannot make fire. Without fire, he is going to freeze to death. There's no two ways about it. He is a veteran of the Alaskan wilderness. He knows he's doomed. And worse than that is he knows the wolves are getting closer and closer. And so no longer was it about what do I have to do to survive this thing? No, it became, how do I want to die? And as he listened to the wolves howl not too far away, he thought to himself, I certainly don't want to die by being eaten alive. And so he made a choice. A week later, the deputy from the U.S. Marshal's office was standing by the creek trying to figure out what happened to Irwin, and he looks out and he realizes there is a lump in the middle of the ice, right in the center of the creek, that he had not recognized at first as anything significant, but now he was looking more closely and he realized it was Irwin. In an effort to avoid being eaten by wolves, Irwin had at some point walked into the middle of the creek, laid down on his back right in that break in the creek where that little bit of water was trickling out, that he had filled up his canteen right there, and he had just laid there, and the water kept spilling out onto him and gradually froze in layers over his whole body, essentially freezing himself into this cocoon in the creek. And so eventually he had frozen to death inside of the creek, but the ice had kept the wolves away. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch and Andrew Kelleher. Story editing by Evan Allen and by Luke Baratz. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. On a day in 2001, a veteran homicide detective put on his gloves and stepped into a cluttered bedroom. He'd been working on a murder case for months, but he still had no clear evidence pointing to any of his suspects. However, a tip from an informant had led him to this bedroom, and he hoped he'd find something useful there. The detective searched the room, and at first, nothing stood out to him. That is, until he saw a piece of notebook paper sitting on a nightstand. On this paper was somebody's list of goals they wanted to accomplish in their life. The detective scanned the list. Most of the goals on the list were pretty standard, except for one, which was totally psychotic. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please hide a tiny speaker in the ceiling of the Follow Button's bedroom, and then play It's a Small World After All on repeat every time the Follow Button tries to fall asleep. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just after midnight on August 31st, 2001, 36-year-old Dana Laskowski sat on her couch sipping a drink at her home in Puyallup, Washington, which is about 35 miles outside of Seattle. Dana had been enjoying a night at home by herself, but as she sat there on the couch, the silence in the house started to feel a bit unsettling. It just was not something she'd gotten used to yet. Dana was the mother of 9-year-old triplets, so the house was typically filled with a lot of noise. But tonight, the kids were 3 hours away, staying with their dad. Dana and her husband Stan had separated the previous year, and after the separation, Dana had moved several hours away to Puyallup, where some of her family lived. Dana and Stan had tried hard to effectively co-parent the triplets. She loved the idea. She loved that the kids still had a good relationship with their father, but not having them around all the time had been a huge transition for Dana. Dana grabbed the remote off the coffee table and turned on the TV, just to have some background noise. She sipped her drink and then kind of laughed at herself. Spending a night on her own really should not be that big of a deal. It should be fun, it should be enjoyable. And plus, even though her triplets would be gone for a few more days still, Dana worked as a nanny for a couple in town, and she'd be able to spend time with their kids, who she loved too. And so Dana told herself to just relax and enjoy a stress-free night. Then she leaned back on the couch and tried to watch TV. But as she was doing that, she suddenly heard this noise coming from the back of the house. She put her drink down, turned off the TV, and then walked out of the room towards the back door. She expected to see her 17-year-old niece and Amanda's best friend, Emily Lauenborg, standing in the hall, because Dana always kept her back door unlocked for these two teenage girls. Amanda and Emily both had strained relationships with their families, so Dana had become a kind of surrogate mother to both of them. She let them use her house to do laundry, take showers, or to just have a place they could come where they would feel taken care of. But when Dana reached the back of the house, she didn't see the girls standing in the hall. She walked to the back door and glanced outside onto the back porch, but she didn't see anybody there either. She figured she must be hearing things. Being home alone could do that after all. So she left the back door unlocked in case the girls did show up later, and then turned back around and headed back to the couch. Even though it was late, Dana suddenly thought about giving her niece a call, just to check in on her. The last time she'd seen Amanda and her friend Emily, they had been spending almost all their time with this group of teenage guys who called themselves the Park Rats, because they always hung around at the same public park. Dana tried to keep an open mind and not judge, but she couldn't help but worry about two young women spending time with a group of guys who did not seem to have any ambition in life. And she knew for a fact that some of the Park Rats had pretty serious drug problems. On top of that, Amanda and Emily were both relatively small girls, and Dana knew they really couldn't protect themselves if any of the guys ever tried to get physical with them. Dana sat down on the couch, still debating if she should call Amanda. However, before she could make up her mind, she heard something at the back door again. Then she heard footsteps coming down the hall. At 10:30 a.m. the following morning, a patrol officer from the Puyallup Police Department pulled up in front of Dana's house. He'd gotten a message from dispatch about an urgent 911 call that had come in that morning. A woman had called and said her children's nanny, Dana Laskowski, had not arrived at the house when she was supposed to. The woman and her husband had both called Dana, but couldn't get a hold of her. And this really worried them, because Dana would never not show up without calling and making sure the kids would be okay. So the woman had asked the police to please do a wellness check on Dana. The officer stepped out of his cruiser and glanced around the neighborhood. This was a pretty busy area of town, with lots of fast food restaurants and shops nearby, so the street could see plenty of traffic at night. The officer walked up to Dana's front door and knocked while calling out her name and also introducing himself. But after a few moments, he didn't get a response, and he also didn't hear any movement inside the house. And so eventually, the officer walked around to the side of the house and pressed his face against a window. However, the curtains inside the house made it difficult to see anything inside. So he walked around to the back of the house, and there he noticed the back door was cracked open. He slowly walked up the steps of the old wooden porch, approached the door, and then called out for Dana again through the crack. But there was still no response. The officer tensed up. He had no idea if this was an innocent mistake by Dana leaving the store open, or if maybe somebody had broken into her house. And if it was the latter, the intruder could still be inside. And so the officer unholstered his gun, pushed the door open, and stepped into the house. As he did this, he walked past an open door and glanced inside. It was a bedroom, and it looked like it had been ransacked. Dresser drawers were open and clothes had been thrown all over the floor, but he didn't see anybody in the room. And so the officer kept heading down the hallway, getting more and more tense as he moved. He eventually reached the front room and stepped inside. And there he found more pieces of clothing on the floor, but he still didn't see anybody. The officer reached for his radio, about to call in a potential burglary, when he looked over at the couch. And immediately, what he saw there told him he was dealing with something far worse than just a break-in. A little later that morning, veteran homicide detective Scott Bramhall of the Puyallup Police Department arrived at Dana's house. He saw a patrol officer standing out front, waiting for him. Bramhall could tell this officer was shaken up by what he'd found inside. Detective Bramhall talked to the officer and got as much information as he could, then he put on his gloves and stepped inside. Bramhall walked into the front room of the house and immediately saw what had upset the patrol officer. The dead body of a woman lay on the couch, with a blanket partially covering her legs, almost like she'd been keeping her feet warm. The patrol officer had found a photo ID during his search, and he had positively identified the woman as Dana Laskowski, the woman he had come to do the wellness check on. Detective Bramhall approached Dana's body and crouched down beside it. Right away, he saw specks of blood on her cheeks and mouth, as well as blood on the carpet by the couch. He also saw deep, dark bruises and ligature marks on Dana's throat. Bramhall looked around the room and saw a scarf on the floor not far from the couch. And his first thought was Dana had most likely been strangled to death, and that scarf could very well be the murder weapon. But the position Dana was lying in was by far the most shocking thing about this crime scene. Dana's head rested on one of her arms, but her other arm was bent at a strange angle behind her back, and her waist was twisted in an awkward position, like her body was contorted. The result of all this was that even in death, Dana appeared like she was actively in some kind of physical struggle. Just then, the detective heard voices and footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned to see more police officers and a small group of forensic technicians walking into the room. Bramhall waved one of the forensic techs over, and the two of them began examining Dana's body together. The tech agreed that Dana had most likely been strangled to death, and the severity of the wounds on her throat indicated that whoever had killed her was pretty strong. Also, Detective Bramhall knew that in a lot of cases of strangulation, the victim fights back really aggressively, thrashing and fighting as much as they can, giving further credibility to the idea that Dana's killer really did have to be big and strong to be able to overpower her. After a few moments, Bramhall left the forensic tech and searched the rest of the house with a few other officers. He told a member of his team to get started on a background check for Dana, while other officers went out to speak with Dana's neighbors to see if any of them had seen or heard something strange that morning or the night before. As the detective made his way through Dana's house, it was clear the place had been ransacked. However, he noticed that some pretty obviously expensive items like a computer and other electronics had been left untouched. This could mean a couple of different things. Either someone had robbed Dana's house looking for something specific, like jewelry, or this entire scene had been staged to look like a robbery. Another thing that stood out to Bramhall was that even though Dana's body and the blood indicated a struggle, there was no sign of forced entry. The back door had been open and unlocked when the patrol officer had first arrived on the scene, and the front door had been locked and showed no signs of a break-in. So Bramhall wondered if Dana had let her killer inside, or if they had unlocked the back door with their own key. As Bramhall was searching the house, one of his team members came up to him. This officer told him that he'd only just started looking into Dana's background, but already he'd found something important. She and her husband Stan were recently separated, and Stan was not answering his phone. That night, after Detective Bramhall had spent hours at Dana's house, he got back to the police station, and he was already feeling antsy. Dana's husband, Stan, like any murder victim's spouse, would basically automatically be a major suspect under almost any circumstance. However, in the few hours since Bramhall had begun working this case, Stan had started to look like the perfect suspect. Stan had not responded to the multiple calls the Puyallup police had made throughout the day. And when Detective Bramhall had reached out to police in the town where Stan lived, they actually went by his house, and there had been no sign of Stan or the triplets. Now, Detective Bramhall did not want to jump to conclusions here. However, he couldn't ignore what might be going on here. A man killing his estranged wife so he could have sole custody of their kids was actually a fairly common thing. Still, Bramhall couldn't do anything until they actually tracked Stan down. So, the detective stayed in touch with the police in Stanstown, and he also contacted the Washington State Police to tell them to be on the lookout for Stan. In the meantime, Bramhall started to gather information on Dana's friends, family, and her employers. Now, he was already planning on interviewing everybody close to Dana, but if Stan didn't turn up soon, he hoped maybe one of them would be able to help police track him down. But the following morning, before Bramhall had met with anybody else, he got a phone call in his office. And as soon as he answered, he heard the voice of a man who sounded upset and a bit frightened. It was Dana's husband, Stan. Stan explained that he had just taken his kids camping and had been at a spot out in the woods that didn't get cell service. So when he'd left the campsite earlier that morning, he saw he had tons of voice messages from the police. And when he had called the cops back, he learned that his estranged wife had been murdered. And then after that, the police had connected him to Detective Bramhall. There was no question in Bramhall's mind that Stan was a major suspect. However, if Stan was innocent, Bramhall could not imagine a worse way to have gotten such horrific news. Bramhall told Stan they needed to talk right now in person, and so Bramhall said he would just drive over to Stan's house right now. Stan said okay, and so Detective Bramhall hung up and then told members of his team to begin looking into Dana's friends and family. Then Bramhall got in touch with the local police where Stan lived to say he was going there to interview him, and then he headed out. The 5-hour drive led Bramhall through the woods and hills of the Pacific Northwest, and as he drove, it hit Bramhall just how slow-going this trip really was. He wondered if Stan had gotten angry about having to make this drive just to see his kids. Maybe he'd gone to Dana's house and confronted her about it. If they'd gotten into a fight, Stan could have flown into a rage and killed her. Now, this was just a theory, but when Bramhall finally got to Stan's house along with a local officer and they met Stan at the front door, Bramhall's theory didn't seem too far-fetched. Because Stan was a big guy. He could have easily overpowered Dana. But more importantly, Bramhall noticed right away that Stan had scrape marks on both of his legs, a sign that perhaps he had a recent physical altercation with someone. Stan led Bramhall and the other officer into his house, and they all sat down together in the kitchen. Bramhall didn't waste any time. he asked Stan flat out if he and Dana had been arguing about their separation, and if that tension had led to any physical altercations. Stan immediately shook his head and said no. He didn't deny that he and Dana argued, and that being separated and trying to co-parent triplets could be stressful, but he said he and Dana had worked hard to help each other and to support each other, and to make their kids' lives as normal as possible. Bramhall immediately changed the subject, and asked Stan how he'd gotten those scrapes on his legs. Stan looked a little surprised by the question, but he said he'd gotten them while playing baseball. Bramhall jotted it down in his notebook, having no sense of whether or not he was actually getting the truth. Finally, Bramhall asked Stan if he'd be willing to submit a DNA sample. And at that, Stan's whole demeanor changed. He'd been cooperative the entire time, but now, he said there was no way he was going to provide DNA. He still didn't really know what was going on here, and he hadn't even talked to a lawyer. Bramhall knew he couldn't force Stan to give them a DNA sample, not yet at least. He also knew a lot of people, even innocent people, didn't like the idea of providing their DNA. So Bramhall stood up, said he'd check into Stan's camping trip alibi, and that he'd be in touch. Hours later, Bramhall made it back to the station, and he felt like nothing had really changed regarding Stan. Stan was still a major suspect, and since he hadn't provided a DNA sample, the police would just have to keep digging into his alibi and his background to see if they could find anything that directly connected him to the murder. However, within minutes of getting back to the police station, one of Bramhall's team members came into his office and told him he had a major new lead. Detective Bramhall was worn out from all that driving he'd just done, but he felt an instant rush when he heard this. He asked the officer what he'd found. The officer said he'd spoken to the couple who employed Dana as their nanny, and they said Dana had a stalker, a guy named William. And Dana had even said to her employers that if she ever turned up dead, William would be the one who had killed her. On the evening of September 2nd, 2 days after Dana's body had been found, Detective Bramhall sat inside of an interview room across the table from Dana's alleged stalker, William. It would turn out William had installed cabling at Dana's house a few months earlier, and since then, he'd been leaving notes and poems on Dana's front door, and he'd been seen lurking around her house a bunch of times by several of Dana's neighbors. Police also found a string of harassing messages from William on Dana's phone. And so all of that had been enough for Bramhall to secure a search warrant, and the search of William's house had led to a disturbing discovery. Inside the interview room, Detective Bramhall pulled out a notebook and put it on the table. Then he asked William if he recognized it. William lowered his head and then nodded. He said it was his personal journal. Bramhall flipped open the notebook and showed William what appeared to be a letter to an unnamed woman. And this letter was filled with all these violent things William wanted to do to her. Bramhall flipped to another page, which was another letter to this same unnamed woman, filled with even more anger and more threats of violence. And so Detective Bramhall said it looked to him like William had been obsessed with Dana, leaving her notes and poetry and spying on her at her house. And when Dana didn't reciprocate, he got angry and started fantasizing about hurting her and began writing about it in his journal. But as William heard this, he just shook his head and said, no, it's not like that at all. William said those letters were an exercise his therapist had told him to do, and they weren't even about Dana. He said he had written that stuff about a woman who'd broken his heart, but it was just to get out the anger and hurt that he felt. He would never actually do any of the stuff he had written. Bramhall sat there in silence for a minute, just looking at the man across the table. Like Dana's husband, William was easily big enough to have overpowered Dana. And even if William was telling the truth about the notebook, he clearly had some kind of unhealthy obsession with Dana. So Bramhall leaned in and told William there was a really easy way for him to clear his name and help the police figure out what happened to Dana. William could provide the police with his phone and a DNA sample. And William didn't hesitate. He said he would do whatever the police needed, anything that would show he did not hurt Dana. In the days following the interview with William, Detective Bramhall and his team met with more of Dana's friends and family. Bramhall had two solid suspects, Stan, the estranged husband, and William the stalker. But he still didn't have any clear evidence pointing to either of them. And most of the people he spoke to didn't provide much more information. But Bramhall eventually met with Dana's 17-year-old niece Amanda at her house, and she told him something that had the potential to turn his whole investigation on its head. Amanda told Bramhall that Dana was like a second mother to her and her best friend Emily. Dana let them come over whenever they wanted, and the house was like this great escape for them. Amanda said Dana even left her back door unlocked, just so they could come in whenever they wanted to. This was a huge piece of news for Bramhall. It now made sense how somebody could have gotten into Dana's house without actually having to break in. They just walked in the unlocked back door. But then Amanda said something else that seemed even bigger. She explained that she and Emily had become friends with a bunch of teenagers who called themselves the Park Rats. And Bramhall knew exactly who they were, and he knew some of them were bad news. More than a few Park Rats had ended up in jail for drugs and violent crimes. And so as soon as Bramhall heard this, he asked Amanda if any of the Park Rats knew that her aunt kept her back door unlocked. And Amanda nodded and said yes. She said she had actually brought a couple of the Park Rats to Dana's house to meet her, just because Amanda thought Dana was so good at taking care of people who didn't really have anybody else. And most of the Park Rats had very difficult home lives. Detective Bramhall left Amanda's house and laid out his next steps. So far, his case had seemed like a pretty straightforward case. Estranged husbands and stalkers were common suspects. But now, he and his team were going to have to track down and interrogate a local gang of teenagers. Finding the Park Rats didn't prove to be too difficult for Detective Bramhall. A few trips to the public park where they hung out and meeting with a couple members of the group who were now in jail was really all it took. But getting the Park Rats to actually give him useful information turned out to be a lot harder. Most of them said they knew about Dana's murder, but all of them denied having anything to do with it. And since Bramhall didn't have any evidence connecting these teenagers to the scene, he couldn't just arrest them and try to force them to talk. And so before long, a month had just flown by, and Bramhall still didn't have anything. And in that time, no new evidence surfaced that pointed to either Dana's husband Stan or the stalker William. And so Bramhall began to worry that maybe Dana's death had been the result of a random burglary gone wrong, and that the police were not even close to tracking down her killer. On October 4th, 2001, so 34 days after Dana's murder, her friends and family finally gathered for her funeral. Because of the ongoing investigation, police had waited longer than usual to release the body back to the family. But now, a funeral home in town was packed with people who had come to express how much they loved and missed Dana, and how much she had been there for them. Detective Bramhall and some members of his team attended the funeral, watching to see if anyone might do something that jumped out at them. But nothing out of the ordinary happened. It was just a group of people grieving the loss of a loved one. After the service was over, Bramhall secured the funeral memorial book, which had been signed by the people who had attended. Bramhall hoped that he could find someone in this book that could maybe offer his investigation a new lead. So Bramhall and his team brought the book back to the station and they went through it, and as they did, they saw some people, in addition to signing it, also left written notes. And one of these written notes totally floored Bramhall. After reading the notes several times, Bramhall felt confident he had just found a massive clue. Bramhall and his team quickly met with the person who had written this note, and what that person said led police right back to the Park Rats. Over the next several weeks, armed with new information from this memorial book, Detective Bramhall tracked down several of the Park Rats he'd already met with, and they were willing to cooperate. All of them still maintained they had nothing to do with Dana's murder, but they said there was somebody the police needed to talk to. It was someone they all knew and who they called the Mutant. Bramhall thought the Mutant definitely sounded like a nickname a group of teenagers would come up with, like something out of a comic book. But the Park Rats said the Mutant was more like a name for a professional wrestler, because the Mutant was really strong and loved to wrestle. And like all professional wrestlers, the mutant had a signature move: choking their opponent, twisting them at the waist, and bending their arm all the way behind their back. When Detective Bramhall heard about this signature wrestling move, immediately images of the bizarre position he'd found Dana's body in ran through his mind. And so, the detective and his team spent the next several days compiling background information, and then they brought the mutant in for an interview. And by the end of that interview, Detective Bramhall knew who had killed Dana Laskowski. Based on information from the mutant, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Dana not long after midnight on August 31st, 2001. That night, the killer and their partner moved quietly through the darkness towards the back door of Dana's house. Once they got there, they opened it up, walked inside, and began walking down the hallway towards the front room. When they got there, they saw Dana standing by the couch, but before she could say anything, the killer demanded that Dana give them some money. Dana stayed calm and said she was sorry but didn't have any money, but the killer immediately snapped back and said Dana needed to hand over some cash right now. Dana repeated that she didn't have any money, and then she asked the killer and their partner to please just leave, but the killer wasn't having it. They walked over to Dana, they grabbed her and shouted that they wanted her money now. Dana tried to push the killer off, but the killer was too strong. Dana screamed, and this only set off the killer even more. They hit Dana in the face and then slammed her to the floor. Dana tried to get up off the floor, but the killer just leapt on top of her and rolled her over onto her stomach. Then the killer saw one of Dana's scarves laying on the arm of the couch, and they grabbed it. Then, before Dana could do anything, they wrapped that scarf around Dana's neck and began choking her. Dana kicked and flailed, but the killer fought off her attack, while the killer's partner just stood there, watching. The killer kept choking Dana with the scarf in one hand, and then with their other hand, they grabbed Dana's arm and they yanked it violently backwards, twisting her around at the waist. Dana tried to scream louder, but now she was gasping for air, and slowly Dana's eyes went wide and she stopped breathing, and she died right there on the floor. The killer let go of the scarf and Dana's arm, and they stood up. They stared down at Dana's body, and then over at their partner, who was still just standing there in a daze. Then the killer picked Dana up. The scarf fell to the floor as the killer laid Dana on the couch, still in her twisted position with her arm pinned behind her back. The killer then grabbed a folded-up blanket from the edge of the couch and covered Dana's feet and part of her legs with it, almost like they were tucking her in. But after the killer stepped away from the couch and kind of surveyed the scene, it was like they began to panic. They yelled at their partner that they needed to make this look like a robbery. The two of them quickly ran to Dana's bedroom and threw open all the drawers and littered the floor with clothing. They also carried some more clothes into the front room and dumped those on the floor as well. And then they ran out of the room, down the hall, and out the back door. The same back door that Dana had always left unlocked just for them, so they could always come to her house to escape their troubles at home. The people responsible for Dana's murder were Dana's own niece, Amanda, and Amanda's best friend, Emily Lauenborg, who all of the park rats knew as the Mutant. The two young women had gone to Dana's house to try to get Dana to give them some money, and when she refused, it was Emily, the Mutant, who attacked and killed her. Emily had not been high on the suspect list because on the surface, she did not fit the profile of the killer. Police had assumed that the killer was a man who was bigger and stronger than Dana, and Emily was a small young woman who was only about 5'2". But it would turn out, despite her small size, Emily was extremely strong and loved to wrestle, hence how she got the nickname the Mutant. The note that Detective Bramhall saw in Dana's funeral memorial book that really stood out to him was written by Dana's niece, Amanda. And it read, "I'm sorry I wasn't a better niece for you. 34 days clean and sober. It's all for you." The funeral was held exactly 34 days after Dana's murder, suggesting Dana's murder prompted Amanda to go sober on that same day. Now, that in and of itself is not totally unreasonable that a death in the family would prompt a big life change. However, to Bramhall, as he was reading through the notes, that note just felt weirdly specific to reference her sobriety and the exact number of days inside of this memorial book when all the other notes were just far less specific. And so to him, something felt off about it. And so the detective followed up with Amanda and asked her about the note, and she would admit to him that she had been struggling with drug addiction. And so Bramhall wanted to know if her sudden sobriety was connected to Dana's murder, like the note implied. And Amanda would say yes, and over the course of this discussion, she would also just tell Bramhall that there was this drug dealer in the park rats who might have killed her aunt. However, when Bramhall met with that drug dealer and several other members of the park rats, they all pointed the finger at Emily, the mutant. Police searched Emily's house and found a piece of paper in her room. On it, she had written a list of goals she had. And one of those goals was to, quote, kill someone and get away with it. Emily eventually confessed to the murder, and Amanda admitted to being in the house during the murder. Dana's niece Amanda aided the police in prosecution, and so she was not charged with any crime. As for Emily, she would take a plea deal and would only serve about 5.5 years in prison. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Both of today's stories are about just how hard it is to really know somebody. Basically, everybody beneath their exterior is oftentimes not what you think they are. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and steal the glass tray inside of their microwave. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Man of Mystery. One afternoon in March of 2004, a 53-year-old handyman named Carl Fenwick sat on the floor of a vacant studio apartment in the rundown apartment building where he lived and worked in northern England. The apartment building was called The Cliff, and it was across the street from the ocean in the coastal town of Seaton Carew. Carl was in the middle of painting the apartment and getting it ready for a new tenant. But he had stopped to eat some lunch and to read a few chapters of one of his favorite spy novels. Carl loved spy novels, and he had a few that he just read over and over again. But as he turned the page, something out the window caught his eye. It was his landlady, Anne Darwin, who lived in a big Victorian house right next door. And at this moment, she was standing in front of her house with her 2 adult sons, Anthony and Mark, and they were all dressed in black and each were holding a wreath made of flowers. And now, Carl felt a little bit like a spy himself, as he secretly watched the family of 3 walk across the street together to this grassy knoll that looked out over the water. Anne and her sons bowed their heads, and Carl could tell they were very likely praying, and then all 3 of them tossed their wreaths into the ocean. Carl knew that Anne and her sons were honoring Anne's husband, John Darwin, who had actually died in a kayaking accident 2 years ago, basically in the water right out in front of their house. Carl could also see that Anne was visibly shaking, so he knew she must be crying. And when he saw that, Carl himself started to feel sad, because Carl cared deeply for Anne. He was not just her handyman and tenant. They had been secretly romantically involved ever since he had moved into the cliff almost 2 years ago. But Carl had actually known Anne for most of his life and had been in love with her for decades. So Carl and Anne were both from a town that was near Seton, Carew. And Carl had first seen Anne on the school bus in high school, but he hadn't worked up the courage to say hello. Then soon after that, he left to go to college, but he had never stopped thinking about her. After college, Carl had started a family of his own and became a school teacher. But he lost everything after making some really bad real estate investments a few years ago. And his financial troubles had led to legal trouble, and finally he'd left his family and gone on the run from the police, living in the woods outside of Seton, Carew. That's when he and Anne had found their way back to each other. One night, in a parking lot near his campsite, Carl saw Anne pull in her car, looking very upset. And this time, he did approach her. It turned out that Anne's husband had only just had his kayaking accident a few weeks earlier, and she was obviously in a very bad place emotionally because of it. She was also desperate for help around the properties that she and her husband had owned together. So that same night, she actually let Carl move into the cliff. And once Carl moved in, he and Anne began a somewhat unconventional romance. Carl would spend his days working to fix up the apartments inside the cliff, and then he would spend his nights with Anne in her house. It was weird for both of them to keep their relationship secret, but they both had their reasons. For Carl, he was just afraid of being arrested if anybody knew where he was. He was on the run. And for Anne, she felt like her family and friends expected her to be a grieving widow basically forever. So she didn't want to look like she basically immediately moved on from her dead husband. Now, at some point, the 2 of them hoped that Anne could sell her properties and that they could move far away together and start over. But they both knew that was easier said than done, because Carl would first have to figure out a way to leave the country without getting arrested. Now, Carl watched as Anne and her sons made their way back across the street, and he went back to reading his spy novel. And as he read the story, he made mental notes about the plot line and the main character, because Carl was actually working on a plan that maybe would allow him and Anne to start their new life together. And he was actually using all of these spy novels basically as inspiration for this plan. He actually smiled to himself as he thought about how brilliant he was being. And he pictured, that someday in the future, an author would likely write a spy novel about him. It would take another 2 years for Carl to finally work out his plan. But finally, one morning in July of 2006, he was ready to put it all into action. On this morning, he walked through the airport near Seton, Carew, trying to act casual as he approached the ticketing counter. He handed his passport to the gate agent and then glanced over his shoulder, looking back to where Anne was. She was standing at the back of the line. She met his eyes, but then quickly sort of looked away because they had agreed to pretend they didn't know each other. When Carl turned back around, he saw the ticketing agent was now staring intently at his passport, and he felt his heart rate begin to pick up. So this passport that Carl was using was a fake. He had created a new identity for himself using the birth and death records of a baby that had been born in the same year as him, which was an idea from the spy novel The Day of the Jackal, about an assassin who constantly changes identities. And if it worked, he and Anne would be able to travel to Panama in Central America. Carl's plan was he was going to stay there permanently if he got to Panama, and he hoped that Anne would love it enough that she would eventually move there too. Carl had read a brochure on Panama that called it a place for schemers, dreamers, and nutcases, which already made him feel right at home. Plus, the country was really cheap compared to the UK and far away from anyone who knew them, so he thought this was like the perfect place for them to move to. But all of that depended on this fake passport being convincing enough that the ticketing agent didn't say anything. And finally, after what felt like a very long time, the agent looked up from the passport and smiled and handed it back to Carl along with his ticket. Carl had to physically stop himself from literally sighing with relief when this happened. And instead, he just, as casually as he could, thanked the agent. And as he walked off, he turned and he sort of winked at Anne, who was still in line. After decades of reading about international spies, Carl kind of felt like one himself. And he liked this feeling a lot. And soon, he would be living permanently as John Jones, an international man of mystery. A few days later, Carl sat beside Anne in the back of a Jeep as a real estate agent drove them through the Panamanian countryside. They sped along the highway into the jungle, and as they did, Carl felt more alive than he had in years. They came around a bend in the road, and suddenly they were driving along a sandy beach, and the realtor pulled over and said to get out and take a look and see if this plot of land felt like it could be their new home. So Carl figured that once Anne sold the cliff apartment building that she owned and combined that money with the money Anne had inherited from her husband's life insurance policies, they'd have around 600,000 pounds in savings, which was around 800,000 American dollars. Now that was more than enough money to get set up, but they were going to need some kind of income in Panama as well. And Carl wanted to buy this land in particular in the jungle and use it to open up an eco-lodge resort. Eco-lodges were becoming really popular in Central America, and tourists paid a lot of money to stay in beachside cabins for a week and go canoeing and horseback riding and jungle trekking. Carl also wanted to build a villa on the property for just him and Anne, right there on the beach. So he led Anne down to the edge of the water and pointed to the tree line on the other side of the bay, and he told her to imagine a row of cabins and a dock for a bunch of canoes and a path that led to a horse stable. And then he pointed to the opposite side of the bay and told her to imagine a beautiful seaside villa where the two of them would live. Anne kicked off her sandals and walked into the water, and Carl could tell that she was picturing what their lives might look like here. To Carl, it was like years of careful planning were finally paying off. I mean, this had been like the best week of his relationship with Anne ever. They had finally been able to act like a normal couple for the first time. They had gone out in public to dinner every night together and walked down the street holding hands. Carl loved living as John Jones. He felt free. And weirdly enough, despite the fact that his identity was fake, he felt like his old self again, the way he used to feel before he got tangled up with all of his debt. By the time they got back to the realtor's office that afternoon, Anne said that she was completely taken with Panama and that, yes, she did want to move here with Carl, and that when she got back to England, she would get her affairs in order and get ready for this big move. Carl beamed, and their realtor grabbed a camera and took a picture of the three of them to commemorate the moment that they had decided to change their lives forever. It took another full year for Anne to sell her properties in Seaton, Carew, and to tell her family that she was moving to Panama, of all places. They'd all been shocked at first, but eventually they started to understand that she really needed to get away from England and all the unhappy memories of her old life. Shortly afterwards, Carl bought a condominium in Panama City so that he and Anne would have a place to live while they built their resort. And then finally, on October 22nd, 2007, Anne moved to Panama permanently. However, when Carl picked her up at the airport that night and drove her to their new home, he had to fake a smile because he had recently discovered some news that was going to throw their new life into jeopardy. And so he gave Anne a quick tour of the penthouse apartment, and then he asked her to take a seat at the kitchen table. And immediately, Anne sensed something was off and looked very worried. Carl took a deep breath, and then he told Anne that he was really excited to build their resort together. But there was one last unexpected obstacle standing in the way of their dreams. He said he had only learned about this obstacle a few weeks ago, and he had been waiting for the right moment for them to talk about it. He had just found out that the Panamanian government had instituted new procedures for anyone moving to Panama from another country. And now, English citizens needed to present a certificate of good conduct from the British police to prove they had no criminal record. Now, this was no problem for Anne, but it was a huge problem for Carl because he was living in Panama as John Jones. So if the police looked into his identity, they would quickly learn that John Jones was a fake identity. Anne put her head in her hands and just said, "What are we going to do?" And Carl said he didn't have an answer yet, but he promised he would figure something out. The next morning, Carl walked with Anne as they window shopped on a busy street in Panama City. And Carl thought about ways that he could get around this awful new procedure. He didn't want to live in this country illegally because he was done hiding. I mean, the whole point of coming here to Panama was so that he and Anne could live together out in the open. He followed Anne into an old vintage shop so that she could look at furniture. And as he wandered around the shop, he came across a bookshelf full of old books, including a few spy novels. Now, all the books were in Spanish, so he couldn't understand any of them, but he still picked one up and began flipping through it, hoping that maybe it would inspire him. And as he did this, he did feel inspired, but it was not by this book. He remembered the plotline of a different spy novel that he had read over a decade earlier. Even when he had been reading the novel at the time, he had thought that that plotline was too crazy to work in real life. But as they walked around that afternoon, Carl kept coming back to that idea, that plotline, and started to see how he might be able to make that work. Finally, at dinner that night, Carl told Anne that he was pretty sure he knew how to solve their visa problem once and for all. He warned her that the idea was risky, but he was confident that he could pull it off. 6 weeks later, on the afternoon of Sunday, December 2nd, 2007, Carl was back in the United Kingdom, wandering around the West End of London. He did his best to look very confused as he walked through Christmas displays and waited until a store clerk came over to ask if he was okay. And Carl gave her a sort of shy smile and then asked, "Why are all the Christmas decorations up?" And when she said it was December, it's Christmas, that's why, he pretended to be confused about what day it was and where he was. And then he asked the clerk for some help. And just like he had hoped, the store clerk frowned with concern and then escorted him into the nearest police station. And she told the officer at the front desk that something was really wrong with this guy. The officer smiled at Carl and asked what the problem was. And now Carl knew that for his plan to work, he was going to have to give an award-winning acting performance here. So he kind of scratched at his head and then told the officer that he had lost his whole family. The officer sat up and asked for his name. And for the first time in 2 years, Carl didn't say John Jones. Instead, he gave the officer his real name. Because Carl had realized that the only way to truly feel like his old self in Panama was to actually become his old self and reclaim the old identity that he had left behind. But to reclaim this identity without also reclaiming all his old debt and legal problems was going to require one more huge lie. So Carl explained to the police officer that he knew his name, but nothing else about himself, because he said he had amnesia. The officer just stared at Carl, obviously dumbfounded. Then he turned and called for his supervisor. From this moment onward, things moved fast, but not in the direction that Carl or anyone else had expected. Carl had believed that if he just claimed he had amnesia, it'd be like wiping the slate clean in England. He could just resume his old name and his old life and make a plan to pay back his creditors now that he was in a better financial situation with the Eco Lodge. And he'd be able to get a real passport with his real name and live happily and truly openly in Panama. But this was not what happened, because almost immediately, newspapers caught wind of Carl's story, and it made the front page. Because to the rest of the world, Carl had this incredible story. He had supposedly spent years wandering around as a homeless person, never knowing his true identity. And so almost overnight, Carl became big-time international news. The entire world wanted to know, where had he been the past few years? Now, Carl had not expected any of this publicity. So he and Anne were both horrified when 2 days later, a British newspaper published a photograph from an obscure real estate website. And in this picture, Carl can be seen standing with Anne and their realtor and beaming with happiness after a day of viewing properties in Panama. And this photograph was very, very bad for Carl because it proved that he had not been wandering around homeless with amnesia in the UK like he had said to police. But this photo was really bad, really the worst, for Anne, because it proved something more shocking and more terrible than regular old financial fraud. This photo revealed a story so outlandish that it sounds like it must have come directly out of a fictional spy novel. Because it would turn out Anne was not the grieving widow she pretended to be, and her handyman boyfriend, Carl Fenwick, was not Carl Fenwick. Carl's real name, the one he had given that police officer in the UK when he pretended to have amnesia, was John Darwin. He was Anne Darwin's dead husband. He and Anne had faked his death in that kayaking accident to escape his debt, and so that he and Anne could claim life insurance money. Not even their own kids knew that their father was still alive. Only Anne and obviously John did. John and Anne were both soon arrested for fraud and wound up serving more than 3 years in prison. John's very unhappy ending does in some ways mirror the ending of the very book, The Day of the Jackal, which he used for inspiration. In that book, the assassin does lots of impressive things to change his identity, but in the end, he still gets caught. Our second and final story is called Spoiler Alert. Today's second and final story is about a man who makes an unforgivable mistake and pays dearly for it. At around noon on October 9th, 2018, a 52-year-old Russian engineer named Oleg Belogasov sat in the common room of a tiny research station on a remote island in Antarctica. The common room was like the general hangout, multi-purpose area at the station, and Oleg was in there watching TV, while his coworker, Sergei, sat in a chair nearby, reading a book. They were both drinking alcohol, and had been for some time, because when they weren't working, there really was not much else to do besides sit around and drink. So Oleg had been at the station for about 6 months. He was part of a 14-person crew that was doing a year-round research stint, observing the island's ocean and weather patterns, and collecting data for their home country of Russia. Oleg was primarily in charge of maintaining the station's machinery and equipment, which took up most of his time. But there was still quite a bit of downtime, which Oleg spent inside, because being outside in Antarctica was generally pretty dangerous. There were hundreds of these lethal, deep ice crevasses that you could barely see, that if you fell into, you're dead, couldn't get out again, or the fall alone would kill you. Obviously freezing temperatures, there's lethal, violent blizzards. I mean, this is not a place built for people. So Oleg and his coworkers really only went outside when their work required it. Otherwise, they stayed put. But inside any of the various buildings at the station, their entertainment options were limited. I mean, there was just this 2-channel TV set, there was a small gym, there was a nearby church, and there was a library. And at this point, Oleg was pretty much sick of everything. I mean, he was even tired of the library. And he loved to read. But the library was really small, and he'd basically read pretty much all the books that were in there. His colleague, Sergei, who was sitting right next to him, he loved reading too. And books were something they both spent a lot of time talking about. So, since Oleg wasn't finding anything good to watch on TV and was feeling bored and kind of stir-crazy, he decided to see if Sergei wanted to get into one of their deep literary conversations. And so Oleg turned off the TV and tossed the remote into the chair and took a swig of his drink. And then he glanced over to the corner where Sergei was reading the novel Fight Club. Oleg had already read Fight Club. It was about this depressed man with insomnia who meets a charismatic stranger and starts this secret club where people literally fight each other. Oleg thought the book was amazing, mostly because it had an epic plot twist at the end. And so Oleg walked over and asked what Sergei thought of the book so far. But Sergei just kind of ignored him. But Oleg wasn't surprised. He knew Sergei really well, since the two of them had worked very closely together on various research projects over the years. So he knew Sergei was generally a very quiet person and not a big talker, whereas Oleg loved getting into big, long, passionate discussions. Sometimes Oleg could get Sergei to open up by asking questions and telling jokes, but today did not seem to be one of those days. Now, this was definitely frustrating for Oleg, but you could tell, Sergei wanted to be left alone. So he stood up and left to go find something else to do. Oleg spent some time just kind of wandering around the station, checking research logs and sipping his drink. He thought about going outside just for a minute to get some fresh air, but when he checked the temperature, he saw that it was below freezing, so he decided against it. And so after 3 hours of trying to kill time, Oleg finally just headed to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. It was around 3 p.m. when Oleg stepped into the dining room, feeling a bit flushed from all the booze he'd been drinking. And the first thing he saw when he got inside of there was Sergei. And Sergei was at a table, still reading Fight Club, just like he'd been doing earlier in the common room. So Oleg got some food and went over to sit with Sergei and see if now, maybe, he was more open to chatting. And to his surprise, Sergei was. When Oleg sat down, Sergei put his book down and looked up, ready to talk, possibly because he'd also had a lot to drink and was feeling kind of chatty. And so the two men began discussing the book, Fight Club. And quickly, their conversation got really energetic because they were both, drunk and excited about what they were saying. And then Oleg made what he thought was a fantastic point about the book and what it all meant. To Oleg, it seemed like everything was going great. But all of a sudden, after making this point, Oleg noticed that Sergei had gone really quiet. And Oleg, who could read Sergei well by this point, knew what this meant. Sergei was done talking and wanted some space. So Oleg looked down at his watch. He actually did need to get some more work done before the day was over, and he was about to look up and tell Sergei that he was going to go leave and check one of their weather instruments. But when he looked up from his watch, Sergei was gone. And at that same exact moment, a wild scream cut through the air right behind Oleg. A few minutes later, in another building, the research station's manager was in his office going through some paperwork when his door suddenly flew open. And when the manager looked up, he saw that one of his employees was standing in the doorway looking completely panicked. The employee's eyes were wide and his breath was ragged, like he was in shock. And when the employee explained why he was so upset, the manager shot to his feet and told the employee not to move. He then grabbed his coat and flew out the door into the freezing cold. The manager pulled on his coat as he ran across the ice-packed ground to the building where the cafeteria was. And the whole way, he just felt his panic growing and growing because what that employee had just said had never, ever happened at their research station before. He wasn't even sure if it had happened in the entire continent of Antarctica before. When the manager finally got to the cafeteria, he flung the door open and looked inside, and immediately he felt sick to his stomach. It would turn out Oleg and Sergei had been co-workers for a long, long time. And they did know each other really well. And what that meant was they knew each other so well that Oleg had sort of learned what specifically really annoyed Sergei. And Oleg used this knowledge whenever he got bored and wanted to find a way to entertain himself. The way Oleg would intentionally upset Sergei was by violating a serious rule that virtually every human being knows not to violate. Even if you've never heard the rule explicitly, you know you don't do this. Every time Sergei would start a new book, Oleg would wait until he got about halfway through and then tell him the ending. This was not just a one-time thing. Whenever they talked about books, Oleg repeatedly ruined them for Sergei, which always made Sergei really, really mad. And that day in the cafeteria, when Oleg sat down with Sergei, he didn't just make a great point about Fight Club. He told Sergei how it ended. And don't worry, if you haven't read it or you haven't seen the movie, we are not going to ruin the twist for you because it is amazing. You should check it out. But Oleg did. And Sergei was very drunk. And like Oleg, he had also been very restless and tense from having been cooped up in this isolated station for months on end. And so this time, when Oleg told him the ending, Sergei completely snapped. He grabbed the knife from the kitchen, walked behind Oleg, and began repeatedly stabbing him in the chest while allegedly screaming, "Didn't see that coming, did ya?" Once Sergei calmed down, he was so shocked by what he'd done that he immediately turned himself in to the station's manager. He was then transported back to Russia and arrested, but he was eventually acquitted since he had no previous record. Oleg's heart was damaged in the attack, but amazingly, he would survive after being transported to a hospital. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Crowell, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen Podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Hello, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. I'm here today to tell you all about what it actually means now that we've moved over to the SiriusXM family. Big picture, it means we are going to make more content for you. Right now, you get one YouTube video a week on Saturday. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to have the Saturday upload be the same, but then also the Mr. Ballen podcast. Well, we've begun already filming those episodes like a YouTube video. So that's a second piece of content every week. Then there's 2 other shows that you guys don't even know about yet, which means on any given week, you could have up to 4 new video pieces of content on the Mr. Ballen channel. And also, all these pieces of content will double as podcasts as well. This new content schedule is going to start early next year. Also, there's one other thing I want to clarify, which is the state of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries and Redacted. Those shows were created in collaboration with Wondery, but now we're partnered with Sirius, and so we're not going to be making any new episodes of either of those shows. For now, if you want to hear my podcast episodes 1 week early and ad-free, make sure to subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. Keep on the lookout for more announcements in the coming weeks. Thank you. One day in 2004, a young man was eating breakfast and watching the local news when suddenly this story about a savage murder came on. Now, at first, the young man actually wasn't paying all that much attention to the story, in part because this murder happened pretty far away from where he lived, about 100 miles away. But at some point on the news, the picture of the murder victim flashed across the screen. And when he saw it, he just froze. And for a minute, that's all he did. He just stared at the screen, could not believe what he was seeing. He put his food down, and then he rushed over to his computer, he fired it up, and immediately began searching through the chat log of an old conversation he had had. And after scrolling for a little while, he eventually found what he was looking for, and at that point, he printed out the entire chat log and rushed to go show the police. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please go over to the Follow Button's house and proceed to eat all their food in their fridge, but put back all the empty containers. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of June 3rd, 2004, a 23-year-old college junior named Jesse Valencia walked into a restaurant in Columbia, Missouri. His friends were already there. They were sitting at a table in the back of the restaurant, and as soon as they saw him, they waved him over. And so Jesse made his way over to sit with them. Jesse was a student at the University of Missouri, and he was majoring in journalism and pre-law. The spring semester had just ended a few weeks ago, and as much as Jesse had loved the semester and he really had enjoyed what he was studying, he was looking forward to some time off. He wanted to see his friends and go to some good parties. Jesse had always been a very outgoing person with a very active social life, but sometimes that characteristic sort of got him in trouble. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, he'd had to go to court over a charge of obstructing a government operation, which he'd picked up 2 months earlier when he refused to leave a house party that the cops were breaking up. And as soon as he sat down at the table with his friends, one of them immediately asked him, like, hey, how'd that court hearing go? And Jesse had said, it didn't go too well. He thought the whole thing was kind of ridiculous, and he had hoped the charge would have been dropped already. But when he had gone to the courtroom, he found out the charge had actually been upgraded. The prosecutor had changed it to obstructing a government operation by physical interference, which was worse. But Jesse said, he still wasn't that worried about it. He said he had pleaded not guilty, and his plan was to fight this thing to the very end, even if it took all summer. However, the reality was this charge was actually the least of Jesse's problems. He had much bigger things weighing on his mind that summer. His longtime boyfriend, Jack Barry, had broken up with him recently, and he was having a very hard time coping with that. Jack had wanted to stay friends, but the reality was, even though, the intention was good, it just made things harder for Jesse, because it meant that Jesse and Jack were still spending quite a bit of time together and still talking and socializing. And while Jack felt like things were over romantically, Jesse didn't feel that way. It just sort of felt like they were perpetually on the verge of getting back together, even though they weren't. And then whenever Jesse would try to talk to Jack about, maybe trying to make things work again, Jack would immediately just turn him down. And so the whole situation was just really difficult. And so without Jack anymore, Jesse had become very lonely. And he had been trying to fill that void with random hookups, meeting guys online and inviting them to the hotel where he worked as a night clerk. But for the most part, it was sort of shallow and didn't mean anything. At one point, Jesse had been having this secret affair with an older man, which had been exciting, but deep down, what Jesse really wanted was just a real relationship like he had had with Jack. And these random hookups were not that. And so at this point, basically every time Jesse went out socially, no matter what he was doing, he was always kind of on the hunt for somebody who could potentially have, long-term relationship potential. And this night was no exception. And so that night, Jesse and his friends had a nice dinner together. And then when they were done, they left the restaurant and walked a few blocks to a gay dance club called SoCo Club. It was dark and the music was loud and thumping. And as soon as they walked inside, Jesse immediately weaved his way through the crowd on the dance floor over to the DJ booth. He asked the DJ to play his favorite song, which was Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. And the DJ just sort of rolled their eyes. Jesse knew the DJ was very likely annoyed with him because Jesse requested that song every single time he came to this club. But Jesse never had let other people's opinions stop him from doing what he wanted. And so he didn't care. He just wanted the song played. And so after he had made his request, Jesse went over to the bar and ordered a drink. And while he waited, he saw a young man standing alone at the other end of the bar. Once the bartender passed Jesse his drink, Jesse went over and asked the man if he wanted to dance. The man smiled and said, sure. And then one dance turned into two, turned into three, and pretty soon the two had spent the whole night together. Now, it was hard to hear each other over the loud music, but over the course of several dances, Jesse had learned that this man's name was Ed McDevitt, and he was training to be a chef. Jesse felt like Ed was a really nice, cool guy, and it seemed like they had an immediate connection. And so when the club closed, Jesse asked if Ed wanted to come home with him. Ed said yes. And after that, Jesse asked his friend Jennifer if she wouldn't mind giving them a ride back to Jesse's apartment. She said, of course. And so shortly after that, the trio left the club, they got in Jennifer's car, and they drove back to Jesse's apartment. And when Jesse and Ed got out, Jennifer said, hey, tomorrow night I'm having a party at my place. You two should come by. And Jesse, he turned to Ed and kind of winked at him and said, yeah, hopefully we'll both be there. And then Jennifer drove off. After Jennifer had driven off, Jesse walked Ed down the stairs to his very run-down basement apartment. And as soon as they went inside, Ed saw this sea of all these history books stacked all over the living room. It would turn out Jesse was really into ancient Greek history. And so Ed began walking around, opening up all these old history books. And as Ed did, Jesse began regaling him with, tales of the Battle of Thermopylae, how the Spartans were outnumbered and how they prevailed, and talking about Zeus and the ancient Greek gods, and just kind of going off all the stuff that Jesse really enjoyed about, ancient Greek history. And Ed, as he listened to it, just said, I really don't know much about history, but it's really fascinating that you're so into it. And so from there, the rest of the night went great for the two of them. They would spend the night together. And then at 10 a.m. the next morning, as Ed was getting ready to leave, they made plans to meet up again at Jennifer's party that night. Before Ed left, he wrote his phone number down on a scrap piece of paper and gave it to Jesse. And Jesse took the paper and then walked Ed to the door and gave him a hug and a kiss before he left. And then once he was gone, Jesse just hoped that, maybe this wasn't just a meaningless hookup. maybe this had the basis of a strong, long-term relationship, the one thing Ed really wanted. Around noon that day, Jesse was eating a quick lunch before heading out for work when he heard a knock on his door. He walked over and opened it up, and he saw his landlord standing in the hallway. And his landlord looked pretty mad. He told Jesse that, hey, it's the 4th of the month, and you still haven't paid rent. Jesse apologized profusely and just said, it totally slipped his mind, and he promised he would get it to the landlord that afternoon. But after the landlord accepted his answer and, Jesse shut the door, he couldn't help but have this sort of sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. Because the truth was, he didn't have the money. Jesse had grown up in a very poor family in a small town in Kentucky. He was actually the first person in his whole family to go to college, and he had paid his bills by working as a hotel clerk, the same job his mother had had back home. Now, Jesse loved his family, and he spoke to them basically every single day. He would call them all the time. But at the same time, he had always felt so trapped in his conservative, ultra-religious hometown. So he had left and tried to sort of reinvent himself as someone new, the kind of person who can do anything and go anywhere. And so even though he had done that, it would turn out that making real money was something that he just hadn't quite figured out yet. Before Jesse left for work that afternoon, he scrounged up all the cash he could find, but it still wasn't enough to make rent. He dropped the cash in the landlord's mailbox anyway, with a note promising he would get the rest of it together in a couple of weeks. Then he walked to his job at the campus inn and spent an uneventful evening behind the front desk, counting down the hours until the end of his shift. And as soon as the end of his shift came, when the clock struck 11 p.m., he bolted home and immediately changed clothes before heading out to Jennifer's party, where he was supposed to meet his new love interest, Ed McDevitt. However, when Jesse walked into that party, he didn't see Ed. He did a lap around the apartment, checking every room, but he wasn't there. And so Jesse just grabbed a beer out of the fridge and began chatting with Jennifer while he waited. But after a while, he checked his watch and realized that either Ed was running really late or he just was not coming. So, trying to tell himself that it was not quite time to be disappointed, maybe there was an explanation here, Jesse went outside and called the phone number that Ed had written down on that piece of paper that morning. Now, this phone number was for a landline phone, and so, Jesse, he punched it in and he listened and it rang for a few beats, and then somebody picked up, and it was a guy, but it was not Ed. It was somebody whose name was Mark Butler, and Jesse had never heard of this guy, and he asked, where's Ed? And Mark explained that he was Ed's roommate, and that actually Ed was asleep right now. He had to work in the morning, and so he had decided actually not to go to the party, to Jennifer's party. He just wanted to sleep. Now, as Mark was telling him this, Jesse was trying to make sense of okay, is Mark like Ed's boyfriend or something? Are they together, or are they just roommates? And also, Jesse couldn't help but feel like Mark clearly did not want to be talking to Jesse right now. It was pretty clear in his tone that he was trying to just get off the phone. But Jesse was not ready to just, mail it in here. He wanted to see Ed. And so he told Mark, well, hold on a minute. Can you please go wake him up? I need to talk to him. And at first, Mark was like, no, he's asleep. He has work in the morning. He does not want me waking him up. But Jesse was relentless and just begged Mark to please, just for a second, put him on the phone. And eventually, Mark relented. About a minute later, a very groggy-sounding Ed hopped on the phone, and as soon as Jesse heard his voice, he was so excited, and he basically pitched Ed hard on why he should not go to bed and come out to this party, and that he really wanted to see him. And also, hey, bring your friend Mark too. That was fine. Now, it's not really clear if Ed was excited about this idea, but he would eventually say, fine, I'll come out and meet you, and I will bring Mark. When they got there, Mark would only stay at Jennifer's party for a little while before he headed out on his own. But Ed and Jesse, they would stick around until about 2 a.m. At that point, they would leave Jennifer's house and go to another party across the street. At around 3 a.m. though, Ed said he really did have to get going. It was so late, he had to get up in the morning, he had to go. And so at this point, Jesse understood that this was reasonable. And so he walked him out to the sidewalk and then asked him if, hey, do you want to come over to my place? But Ed said, no, really, I have to get home. I have to go to bed. However, before Ed did finally leave, the two of them would make plans to see each other in just a couple of days. After Ed had taken off, Jesse wandered across the street to say goodbye to Jennifer, and then after that, he began making the walk to his own apartment. And as he was making this short walk to his own place, he began to think that he didn't want to go home alone. If Ed didn't want to come over, well, he was going to find somebody else who would. And so his first thought was to call his ex, Jack. And so Jesse called Jack a few times, and when Jack did not pick up, after all, it's 3 a.m, and they are no longer in a relationship, it's sort of reasonable that he wouldn't. But at that point, Jesse still wanted to see him, and so he walked a few blocks out of his way to make an actual stop at Jack's apartment. Jesse went right up to the door and banged on it, but nobody came to the door. Jack didn't answer. At this point, Jesse began to wonder if, maybe Jack's out with somebody else right now, and he suddenly felt so jealous. Or worse, maybe Jack is here and he knows I'm here, but he doesn't want to see me and he's ignoring me. After a couple of minutes of standing there and knocking a few more times and still not hearing anything from Jack, Jesse finally gave up and stumbled back to his own apartment, drunk and lonely, and a bit heartbroken. Jesse finally stepped foot inside his apartment and shut the door behind him at about 3:45 a.m. However, right after he'd gotten undressed and flopped down on his bed, he heard a knock at the front door. At 2 p.m. the following day, so Saturday, June 5th, 2004, a college student walked out of an apartment just down the street from Jesse's building, and they were carrying a backpack and a cooler. His friends had just pulled into the parking lot, and they were about to head out for a weekend trip to St. Louis. But while he was loading his stuff into the trunk, he noticed somebody lying in the grass nearby, wearing nothing but a pair of running shorts. Now, at first, he assumed, this was just somebody passed out drunk from a crazy Friday night party, which sort of happened all the time in a college town like Columbia. But when he took a few steps closer to be sure this person was okay, he saw flies buzzing around their body. About 30 minutes later, Columbia police detective John Short felt his pager go off. He unclipped it from his belt loop, and he saw there was a message from his boss's phone number that just read 911. Detective Short called his boss right away, and he was given the address for a crime scene just off the University of Missouri campus. Short drove there, parked his car on the curb, and then walked over to the yellow tape that was keeping crowds of worried neighbors away from this crime scene. Another detective, Tim Geiger, waved to Short and led him over to the patch of grass where the victim was lying. It was a young man sprawled out on his back, and he was wearing a pair of light blue running shorts with no shoes, no socks, and no shirt. And across his throat was this very deep gash. The medical examiner was already there, and she was crouched down next to the body, and she told Detective Short that a few things were already standing out to her. She pointed to the bruises that were all over the victim's face, their arms, and their torso. But when she lifted the victim's hands, there were no defensive wounds on them. She told Short that was pretty unusual for a knife attack, where the victims usually got their hands up, trying to defend themselves, and as a result, they got their hands cut up. She also pointed out that the blood had run down both sides of the victim's neck and pooled under his body. But there was no blood at all on the front of his body, which meant he was probably lying down right there in the grass when his throat actually got cut. Finally, the medical examiner pulled back the victim's eyelids and showed Short the hemorrhaging in his eyes, which they both knew was typically a sign of strangulation. And so putting it all together, Short theorized that, the victim's killer had likely choked him out and then laid him on the grass and then slit his throat while he was laying there unconscious, unable to defend himself. The detective looked down at his victim's bare feet and noticed they were covered in dirt, like he had been running at some point outside. Short doubted that the encounter between his victim and the killer began on the lawn where the body was found, and now he just wondered if maybe there had been some sort of a chase here, and that this was just where the killer had finally caught up to the victim. But since there was no ID on the victim, Short had no idea who he was or where he'd been running from. And so Short stood up and stepped away from the body so crime scene techs could load it into a body bag. Just then, another squad car pulled up, and 2 more officers got out. Sergeant Kenneth Smith and Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was the beat cop who typically patrolled this neighborhood, so another sergeant on scene had radioed for him to come over and see if maybe he could help identify the victim. And so at this point, Short told the crime scene techs to go ahead and unzip the body bag and let Officer Rios take a look. And Rios came over and he looked inside, and after a second, he said that he did recognize this young man. He said it was a college kid that he'd actually arrested at a house party just a couple of months ago. He said his name was Jesse Valencia. And so, less than an hour into his investigation, Detective Short now had a name for his victim and some pretty good guesses about how his victim was killed. His next task was figuring out who might have wanted Jesse Valencia dead. So, Short looked up Jesse's address, and he found his apartment building was only a block away, so he walked over there. And while the forensics team went inside the apartment to look for evidence, an officer was posted outside the building to make sure no one came or went until the crime scene was officially cleared. Short walked into the building and headed down the stairs to Jesse's unit. And there, the crime scene tech who was dusting the doorway for prints told him that when they'd arrived, the door was actually already open. And so Short went inside the actual unit and began looking around. There was no blood anywhere, and nothing was broken or overturned, so there was no clear sign of a struggle. But the door being left open suggested that Jesse must have left in a hurry. And this certainly matched Short's theory about the fight between Jesse and his killer starting in one location and ending on the lawn. Short figured that, Jesse must have run out of his apartment in a panic and made it a block away to that grass before his killer finally overtook him. And so as Short began to consider this, he also started to think, okay, well, Jesse, who appeared to be in reasonably good shape for his age, if he was chased down and tackled and killed only a block away from his apartment, it sort of suggested that his killer likely was pretty strong and pretty fast. So we're talking about somebody who is in relatively good shape. That's the killer. At least that's the profile he's developed in his mind. And also, the way that Jesse was actually killed, having his throat cut open so violently, it just seemed kind of personal, which suggested that whoever killed Jesse likely was somebody Jesse actually knew. And so with that in mind, Short finished a sweep of Jesse's apartment and then asked a crime scene tech to prioritize getting access to the cell phone and computer that he saw on Jesse's desk. Then he walked out of the apartment and across the hall to the door of Jesse's closest neighbor, and he knocked. A moment later, a very confused-looking young man poked his head out and asked Short what was going on. Short told him that he was investigating a murder and wanted to ask him a few questions. The young man at first just seemed totally shocked and appalled to be hearing this. But then it was like this look of realization washed over his face. He told Short that the previous night, he had actually woken up to the sound of very clearly two grown men fighting in Jesse's apartment. And one of those men was clearly Jesse, because this neighbor heard Jesse clearly saying over and over again, "No," and "Stop it," to this other man. Now, the neighbor kind of sheepishly said, they didn't actually do anything about this. They actually just kind of banged on their own wall and said, "Hey, stop it over there." And then shortly after that, the noise had stopped, and the neighbor had kind of forgotten about it and gone to sleep, not realizing what he was likely hearing was the beginning of Jesse's murder. The neighbor told Short that when they had woken up that afternoon, he'd actually gone across the hall to apologize to Jesse for being so rude the night before. But the neighbor said he found Jesse's door was open, and he didn't look inside. He felt like that was kind of rude. But what he thought was, okay, maybe Jesse was so drunk the night before, that was part of the reason that he must have been having this fight. And so perhaps he was so drunk, he just forgot to close the door. The neighbor said he did try knocking on the opened door a couple of times, but Jesse never came to the door. And so the neighbor just kind of left it at that and went about their business. And so after hearing this, Detective Short asked this neighbor if he had any idea who the other man was that Jesse was fighting with. But the neighbor said he didn't. Jesse, for the most part, kept to himself, and really the neighbor didn't know Jesse well at all, so he did not know who this other person was. After that, Short thanked the neighbor for the information, then he turned around and headed back inside of Jesse's apartment. And so at this point, Short was convinced that, based on the neighbor's testimony, that whatever fight led to Jesse's death likely did begin in Jesse's apartment. And so now, Short just had to figure out who were the people that could have potentially been inside of Jesse's apartment late at night like that. Was this somebody who was a friend, a love interest? Was Jesse trying to kick them out and it spurned a fight? He didn't know, but who were the people in Jesse's life that could have been there late at night? That's what he had to figure out. And luckily, at that very moment, one of the crime scene techs had Jesse's cell phone and he was holding it in the air like he had found something. Now, they wouldn't be able to do a full phone dump until they got it back to the station. And they hadn't even touched the laptop yet. But they had gotten access to Jesse's call logs, and the tech told Short that there was something in there that he definitely wanted to see. Because the last time Jesse used his cell phone, according to this log, it was to call somebody named Jack Barry 7 times between 3 and 3:18 that morning. So right away, Detective Short looked up Jack Barry's information, and he found his apartment's address and saw it was not far from Jesse's, and so he drove right over there. Short knocked on the door, and just a moment later, a young man answered, and he had very red, puffy eyes like he'd clearly been crying. Even though Jesse's body had only been discovered a few hours ago, this young man did not seem surprised at all to see the detective. He told the detective that he had already heard the terrible news a friend had told him. After exchanging niceties and the young man confirming that he was in fact Jack, Short followed Jack into his living room. And as they sat down, Short asked Jack about all those 3 a.m. phone calls from Jesse. Jack looked like he was really struggling to hold it together as he told the detective that Jesse was his ex-boyfriend and Jesse had kept badgering him, Jack, for them to get back together, and Jack didn't want to. And so those phone calls were very likely a product of more badgering from Jack. Jack said the night before, he had been woken up by his phone ringing over and over and over again, and before he could even look at the caller ID, he heard a knock at his front door, and he saw it was the middle of the night, and then he leaned over and saw the caller was Jesse, and he sort of figured that, okay, he's calling me, it's very likely him at the front door, I don't want to see him right now, and so Jack just decided he would ignore Jesse and hope he went away. Now, when Jack said this, it seemed very clear he was sort of reliving that moment in his mind. Like, maybe if he had let Jesse in or engaged with him in some way, maybe Jesse would still be alive. That was sort of the insinuation. But Detective Short was thinking, okay, well, even though he seems like he's being very earnest in telling me this, it does mean that he doesn't really have an alibi. He's basically saying, at the time, Jesse was killed, I was home alone by myself, which was pretty weak. However, before Short could begin to poke holes in the alibi, Jack said that, despite the fact that they had broken up, that he and Jesse were, at least in his mind, still on good terms. In fact, they had spoken just the day before on the phone, before getting all those nighttime phone calls. It was during the afternoon, and during that phone call, Jesse had told him about a new guy he'd met at a club the night before, and his name was Ed McDevitt. That night, Detective Short stood outside of an interrogation room at the police station, watching Ed McDevitt through the two-way glass. Short knew his investigation was moving basically at lightning speed here, but there was still quite a bit of pressure on him to get this case solved even faster, because Columbia was a college town where kids were used to feeling safe, and the murder of a student just a few blocks off campus had sort of shattered that sense of trust. And so, students and parents and staff of the university really wanted Short to get this thing done. And now, looking at Ed through the glass, Short wondered if maybe this was the killer. Maybe this was the guy. After all, Ed was shaking and fidgety looking. He seemed sort of like an emotional wreck, which could mean, of course, he was just upset because he was connected to the murder victim. That's traumatic. Or it could mean he's hiding something, and now he's about to be interrogated by the police. Something that would certainly cause a big emotional reaction. Eventually, Short went inside and sat down across the table, and he asked Ed to explain exactly what he had done the night before. And Ed, in a very nervous, shaky voice, told the detective that he and his roommate, a guy named Mark Butler, had met Jesse at a party a little after 11 p.m. He said he ultimately went back home again around 3 a.m., leaving Jesse on the sidewalk, still very alive and well. Ed said his roommate Mark had actually seen him return to his apartment at 3 a.m., and Ed said when he went inside, he went straight to bed, and then he had gotten up early for work. Ed said he was at work when he got the call from police, telling him that Jesse had been found dead. Detective Short listened to Ed's story and asked a few follow-up questions, and then also took a DNA sample from Ed. And then after that, he told Ed that he was also going to get a warrant to search Ed's home. Ed was already such a wreck that, when Short told him about this, search of his home, Ed didn't even really react. However, when Short left the interview room, despite feeling pretty confident that Ed could absolutely be a suspect, he also went and, followed procedure and looked up Ed's roommate, Mark Butler. And he discovered in the police department system that there was Mark Butler, and sure enough, he had a criminal record. So, overnight, while a forensics team was searching Ed and Mark's home, Short actually brought Mark down to the station for an interview. But in reality, Short wasn't expecting Mark to become this primary suspect here. He just wanted to be thorough and rule out anybody who'd seen Jesse that night, and obviously Mark was one of those people. But almost immediately in their interview, Mark started saying some very odd things. He told Short right out the gate that he did not like Jesse, and actually he said point blank that he didn't really care that Jesse was dead. But he also clarified to Detective Short that, he was just Ed's roommate. He was not seeing him romantically. So this had nothing to do with jealousy. He just did not like Jesse. Mark confirmed that he did see Ed when he returned from the party around 3 a.m., just like Ed had said. But Mark had actually not stuck around. He said that after Ed had come back to the apartment, Mark had left to go on a date of his own, and he actually didn't know what time he got back. And so as he was saying this, Short realized that meant Mark was out and about, sort of unaccounted for, at the same time that Jesse was killed. And so obviously, something seemed off about Mark. And so Short took a DNA sample and added Mark to the suspect list. The next morning, Sunday, June 6th, after catching a few hours of sleep, Detective Short gathered his team for a meeting. The mood was tense. Everybody was exhausted and very much on edge from spending nearly 24 hours straight working on this case. But when they went around the room and talked about the flood of leads they'd all followed up on yesterday, it didn't actually seem like they had much to show for it. There were now several suspects in play, but none of them seemed to have a good reason to want to kill Jesse Valencia. Jesse apparently had been hounding his ex-boyfriend Jack about trying to get back together, which Jack did not want, and the multiple late-night phone calls and the knocking on the door unannounced, it just seemed like harassment. So it was possible that maybe Jack had gone over to confront Jesse and things got out of hand. But Jack had told Detective Short that he and Jesse had remained friends after the breakup. And some of the other detectives said that Jesse's friends had said the same thing. The two had remained friends. So it seemed pretty unlikely that things between them would have escalated so much that, somebody got killed. Then there was Ed McDevitt, Jesse's new lover, who had seemed pretty nervous during his interrogation. One of the detectives told Short that while searching Ed's house, they'd found a bag full of chef's knives, and some of them were large and sharp enough that they could easily have been the murder weapon. But Ed worked in a restaurant and was training to be a chef, so owning kitchen knives was hardly a smoking gun. And then as for Ed's roommate, Mark Butler, he did have a criminal past and openly said he did not like Jesse and didn't care that he died. But they'd only met one time, and very likely they would never have seen each other again. So it seemed very unlikely that he would go through the trouble of following Jesse home and killing him. Like, to what end? And so Detective Short was getting really frustrated. He just couldn't make sense of any of these suspects. It was like something was missing here. And so he turned to two of his detectives, Jeff Westbrook and Barbara Cook, and told them to go to some local bars that Jesse frequented and just sort of ask around about Jesse, in case there were other leads that they had not uncovered yet. However, right after Detective Short walked out of that meeting that morning, another detective ran up to him and pulled him into a quiet corner and told him a tip had just come in, and it was so sensitive that they were going to have to keep it under wraps even amongst the investigators. The detective told Short that a friend of Jesse's who lived in St. Louis had called the tip in through Crime Stoppers. He said that he and Jesse chatted online all the time, and that Jesse at one point had told him about a secret affair he was having with an older man. And this older man was actually an officer in the Columbia Police Department. Later that day, so this is Sunday, June 6th, 2004, 2 days after Jesse was killed, Detective Short sat at his desk flipping through printouts of all these online chat logs. And these logs showed conversations between Jesse and the friend of his who had called in the tip that Jesse was having this affair with an officer from Short's own police department. In the chats, Jesse wrote all about this relationship. Jesse had seemed to find it pretty exciting at first, having this police officer come by in uniform and carrying on these secret meetups in the middle of the night. But recently, Jesse had begun to suspect that this police officer was married, and this made Jesse furious. He had told this friend in the chat log that he wasn't going to be someone's other woman. However, to Short's frustration, Jesse never actually named the officer that he was having this affair with. He only ever referred to him as Columbia's finest. And so whoever this mystery cop was, Detective Short thought they were the most likely suspect. Because unlike Jesse's other lovers, this officer had something to lose if this relationship went south. If Jesse told anybody about this affair, well, the police officer's career could be on the line because they clearly were carrying on this totally illicit affair while on duty. That's not okay. And also they were using their position and power potentially to actually land this relationship. And then also on top of that, the police officer's marriage would likely be destroyed. But Short also knew that he had to move very carefully here, because now he was investigating his own department, which meant that the killer could literally be in the room with him at any time. And so as he walked through the office to refill his coffee, Short found himself scanning the face of every officer he passed. And he realized there wasn't a single person here he could actually trust. Short brought all the files on Jesse's case into his office, and then he told his secretary to find him a roster of the department's entire staff. Then he locked the door, sat at his desk, and pulled out the records on Jesse's friends who had been interviewed already. And he went down the list himself, calling each and every one of them to dig for more information. Quite a few of them said that Jesse had told them about this cop he was sleeping with. And one of them remembered Jesse referring to this officer as just Anderson. And so when Short's secretary came back with the staff roster, Short began looking through it, and he discovered out of the 200 plus officers in the entire department, there were only 2 officers that had the name Anderson: Brad Anderson and Ted Anderson. And so the next step was trying to figure out if either of them had a connection to Jesse Valencia. And so Short pulled out the records from Jesse's arrest at the house party back in April. And as he flipped through it, he realized Brad Anderson was one of the 3 officers who responded to that party. The pieces fit together perfectly. Jesse and Brad Anderson, the police officer, would have met around the same time that Jesse began messaging his friend in St. Louis about this secret affair with a cop. And so at this point, Short felt like he had just found the killer. So he grabbed a manila folder off his desk, stepped out of his office, locking the door behind him. Then he did a lap around the whole station, and eventually he spotted Brad Anderson in the locker room, chatting with a few other officers as he put on his uniform. Now, Short wanted to be very careful here, because if Brad Anderson was the killer, he certainly didn't want him to realize he was under suspicion right now. So Short waited in the hallway until Brad walked out of the locker room, and then as casually as possible, Short caught up with him and pulled him aside. Short opened up the manila folder he had brought with him and showed Brad a photo of Jesse Valencia, asking if he recognized him. And Brad squinted at the photo for a second, and then after thinking, he said, "Yeah, that's the kid I arrested at a party a few months ago." Short asked Brad if he had seen Jesse at all since the arrest. And Brad nodded and said, yeah. He said that about a month ago, Jesse had called in a noise complaint, and Brad had been the one sent out to check on it. But by the time Brad got there, the noise had stopped, so he was only there for a couple of minutes before leaving. And that was it. To Short, nothing about Brad's demeanor seemed nervous or suspicious. In fact, it really seemed like he didn't have any clue why the detective was asking him about Jesse Valencia. So if he was the killer, it seemed like he was going to be very hard to crack. Short was about to let Brad go and just wait to talk to him once he had more evidence, but just then, Brad's partner, Officer Rios, walked by. And when he walked by, he looked over and he saw the manila folder with Jesse Valencia's photo inside of it that Short was showing Brad Anderson. And Rios, without even thinking, made this comment under his breath that was clearly directed at his partner. It was like this really in bad taste comment where he was like, "Oh, looks like your gay lover's dead." When Short heard this, he practically sprinted back to his office. Brad Anderson sort of shrugged off the comment made by Rios about, Jesse being his gay lover, but Short felt like what Rios said was a pretty big deal, because even though, again, it was terrible in bad taste humor, that's a terrible thing to say, but maybe there's truth there. Maybe Rios knows that Brad Anderson was seeing Jesse Valencia. Maybe they really were in a relationship. Now, in the moment, Short did not aggressively follow up on that comment and demand to know if Brad had actually been in a relationship with Jesse before he died. Instead, all 3 of them just kind of went their separate ways, and Short, hustled back to his office. And when he was in his office, right as he sat down, there was a knock on the door. And when the door opened, it was Short's secretary. And she told him there was someone who had been waiting to see him. And then she let in this very nervous-looking young man who introduced himself as Jesse's friend. And he said his name was Andy Schermerhorn. Andy sat down and told Short that just a few weeks earlier, he and Jesse had gone out together and then gone back to Jesse's apartment. But around 3 a.m., they were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jesse went to answer it, and a uniformed police officer walked in, shining a flashlight. And to Andy's surprise, Jesse led this officer right into the bedroom, and he joined them for a threesome. And then after they were done, the cop told Andy, "You better keep this a secret." Detective Short couldn't believe it. I mean, the final piece of evidence he needed had just fallen into his lap. Andy said he did not know the officer's name. So Detective Short got out a department yearbook and told him to flip through it to see if maybe the guy he saw that night was in there. But Andy just held up his hand and said he didn't need to do that. And Detective Short was like, "Well, what do you mean? Why can't you do that?" And Andy said, "Well, because when I came in here, the guy I met, he was out in the hall." Based on the investigation that would follow this revelation, the following is what happened to Jesse Valencia in the early morning of June 5th, 2004. Around 3 a.m., right around the time that Jesse was leaving his friend Jennifer's party, Jesse's killer was drinking beers with a few friends after work. And then, just before dawn, the killer wrapped up, got in their car to drive home. But as they were driving, they decided to make a stop along the way at Jesse's apartment. They were expecting another quick, no-strings-attached, late-night secret hookup, but when they got there, Jesse was very drunk and in a terrible mood. Jesse told the killer that he had figured out they were married, and so now he was not interested in them at all. He didn't want to see him anymore. But when he told the killer to leave and the killer refused, Jesse said, "Fine, I'll go to your police chief and I will tell them about our affair." And that's when the killer snapped. If their secret got out, it would cost them everything. So in their mind, they had to silence Jesse before he could ruin them. Jesse tried to run, but he only made it about a block before the killer caught up with him, wrapped an arm around his neck and put him in a vicious chokehold until his body went limp. And then the killer laid Jesse out on the grass, took out a pocket knife, and brutally slashed his throat. And then, on the way home, the killer very skillfully disposed of the murder weapon, ensuring nobody would ever find it, because they knew the knife was the only piece of hard evidence that could ever link them to the murder. After that, they made their way back home, parked in the driveway, and as they were walking up to the front door, they looked up and saw their wife in the kitchen window, preparing a bottle for their baby son. And then just before going inside, the killer unpinned the name tag on their uniform that said Anderson, and they swapped it for another name tag that they had hidden in their glove box. And this name tag was the killer's real name, Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was Brad Anderson's partner. He was the one who identified Jesse's body at the crime scene and made that awful comment about Brad Anderson's gay lover. It's believed that Officer Rios was lying to Jesse about his name, and in fact, he actually stole the name tag not of Brad Anderson, but of the other Anderson, Ted Anderson. He was using his name tag and parading around like he was him whenever he was with Jesse. Rios was arrested, and in May of 2005, almost a year after Jesse's murder, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. But after an appeal, he got a new trial, and the charge was reduced to second-degree murder. However, he was still found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballen podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, See ya. Today's podcast will feature two medical mysteries that sound like they are straight out of a horror movie. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Gasp, and it's about a horrifying medical condition that was discovered when multiple people began presenting these same life-threatening symptoms. And the second and final story you'll hear is called All in Their Heads, and it's about a mysterious disease that almost wipes out an entire native tribe. But where this disease comes from will make you squirm. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please buy the Amazon Music follow button a gift certificate to a massage parlor. But before they go in, make sure to replace all the massage oils with honey and fire ants. Okay, let's get into our first story called Gasp. At 5:30 p.m. on November 21st, 2016, Jody Santoro, who was a 21-year-old mother in Melbourne, Australia, woke up to the sound of her 4-month-old son crying. Outside, there was this horrible thunderstorm going on. All this rain and hail were pelting the roof, and the wind was so strong that all the windows in the house were rattling. Jody reached over and grabbed her phone on the nightstand and checked the time, and she saw right away that she had overslept. However, it had been a really hot day that day, and she was so drained from the heat and also taking care of a 4-month-old that she wasn't really surprised she had overslept. But as the sound of her son's cries intensified, Jody knew, no matter how tired she was, she needed to get up and go tend to him. But the instant her legs swung off the bed and she actually tried to stand up, she knew something was wrong, and it had nothing to do with being tired. She had this incredible sense of dizziness come over her, and then her chest suddenly tightened up to the point where she could barely even breathe in. She found herself grabbing the bed just to steady herself. However, as alarming as this was, Jody didn't panic. She knew this feeling. She had been dealing with asthma for years, and she knew this was the start of an asthma attack. And so Jody reached over for her inhaler on the nightstand. She picked it up, brought it to her lips, pressed it down, and then took in a measured breath of the medication, expecting to pretty much immediately feel relief. But she didn't. The inhaler wasn't working. Jody again pressed down the inhaler harder this time and took a bigger breath in, hoping that a bit more medication might do the trick. But again, it just was not working. And so now, with panic rising inside of her, as she's, still struggling to breathe, her son is still freaking out and she can't tend to him. And all she was thinking is, I have to get my nebulizer, which is basically a more robust version of an inhaler. It provides more medication more quickly into your body. However, the nebulizer, which was just over in her closet, required some setup. And she knew she felt so frantic right now and she was shaking so much that she didn't think she'd be able to set it up or even set it up in time before she passed out. Just then, her fiancé walked into the bedroom, drawn there by the sound of their son crying. But the second he walked in, his attention was not on their son, it was instead on Jody, who by now was clutching the bed and kind of hobbled over and very clearly having some sort of medical emergency. Jody turned to him and began to say, I can't breathe. But her fiancé already knew she had asthma. He knew what these attacks looked like. And so without even needing to be told, he rushed to the closet, set up her nebulizer, and then put the mask right over her face. And as soon as it was, Jody took in the biggest inhale she possibly could, really believing this was going to stop the asthma attack. But just like the inhaler, the nebulizer didn't work. It felt like with every breath she was taking, her lungs were shrinking, not expanding. And so Jody turned to her fiancé and croaked out, "Call an ambulance," her voice barely audible. And so her fiancé, who also was now beginning to panic, grabbed the phone, and as he was talking to the dispatcher, trying to relay all the details of what was happening, outside this thunderstorm was only getting worse and worse. The hail and the rain were battering the sides of the house, and all the windows were shaking. I mean, it was absolute bedlam inside of this house. The next few minutes were torture for Jody. She laid on the bed waiting for paramedics. Her breaths at this point were so small, so shallow, like she knew she was about to pass out any second. And then finally the paramedics rushed inside. She knew there were 2 people in the room, but it was so chaotic. And all she could say when they showed up in the room was, "I'm going to die. I'm going to die." The paramedics lifted her off the bed, they put her on the gurney, and as they wheeled her out the door towards the ambulance, her world went totally black. The paramedics rushed Jody to Sunshine Hospital, and on the way, they tried to stabilize her by squeezing these oxygen bags, forcing oxygen into Jody's lungs. And as they were doing that, Jody's fiance was following the ambulance right behind, white-knuckling the steering wheel, praying his fiance was going to survive this asthma attack. When the ambulance finally arrived at Sunshine Hospital, the emergency room was mayhem. Paramedics quickly wheeled Jody in on her gurney, shouting out her vital signs to the doctors waiting near the door. Her fiance, meanwhile, watched helplessly as the medical staff surrounded her and inserted IV lines, hooked up monitors, and began intubating her to force even more oxygen into her lungs. But fortunately, this rapid medical intervention, once Jody got to the hospital, appeared to work. Because not long after getting there, Jody did begin to stabilize, not enough to suggest that she was actually all better, but her condition basically began to improve. However, the moment she began to improve, instead of the medical team, talking to her and figuring out what happened and making sure she really was on a path to recovery here, instead, the medical team literally ran out of her room back out to the front of the ER because by this point, the Sunshine Hospital ER was overflowing with patients. There were all these people in the waiting room and also outside, and basically everybody had the same symptoms as Jody. They couldn't breathe. There were people slumped on the ground against the wall, screaming for help. I mean, the medical team was totally overwhelmed. And on top of that, there were ambulances literally lined up around the block waiting to drop off patients. There just wasn't any more space. But nonetheless, doctors and nurses and the medical team at the hospital worked furiously, moving from one patient to the next, sometimes in an exam room, sometimes out in the waiting room, sometimes outside. It's wherever the patients were. But the weird thing is all these people, they had the same symptoms, these severe asthma attacks, yet many of the people that were showing up had never had asthma in their lives before. So how was this happening? This went on for hours and hours. And really, the situation in the hospital only continued to get worse, with more and more and more patients showing up with worse and worse symptoms. And so during this madness, Jody, who really hadn't gotten better, she just stabilized, she actually was moved out of the emergency room and over to the ICU, pretty much just to create one more space for new patients. And so in the ICU, Jody's fiance sat next to her, gripping her hand, listening to the sound of the monitors beeping steadily all around her. Outside the room, he could see doctors and nurses and medical staff sprinting up and down the hallways, looking frantic and worried. He had no idea what was happening here. He just hoped Jody would be okay. But it would turn out there actually was someone who knew exactly what was going on. A university researcher named Philip Taylor had actually predicted this the day before. Professor Taylor was an expert in atmospheric allergens, a field so niche that barely anybody outside of his small research circle had even heard of it. And so on the afternoon of November 20th, the day before, Taylor had been at home in his office analyzing data when he noticed something very alarming. All of the ingredients for a catastrophic event were aligning in the forecast, and the patterns were so precise that it stopped him cold. Taylor was stunned. He'd spent years studying the effects of weather on public health, but he'd never seen anything like this before. And at the same time, Taylor also realized that as alarming as this was, very few other people, if anybody, would see this as a problem. He was like the one person in the world that had the expertise to see how catastrophic this might actually be. And so desperate to warn others, he wound up posting a very urgent announcement on this weather website that he managed, but unfortunately, it just wasn't seen by enough people in time. And so now, as hospitals all across Melbourne overflowed with people gasping for air, Taylor sat in his backyard watching the storm unfold. The sky was pitch black, rain and hail was coming down, the wind was whipping, and off in the distance, all he could hear was thunder and sirens. And he knew, unfortunately, his prediction had been right. Just like Professor Taylor's weather models had predicted, on November 21st, 2016, Melbourne, Australia was hit by an extremely rare event known as thunderstorm asthma. This deadly phenomenon can only occur when three very specific weather conditions align. 1, high heat during the day, 2, a very powerful thunderstorm, and 3, extremely high pollen levels. Melbourne's heat that day had caused unusually high concentrations of ryegrass pollen to hang in the air. And then when that huge thunderstorm rolled in, the intense humidity, the wind, and the rain shattered the pollen grains into microscopic fragments. And then these tiny particles, which were way smaller than regular pollen, were carried by this storm deep into people's homes and into their lungs. Unlike normal pollen, these microscopic fragments bypassed the body's typical defenses and embedded themselves deep into people's lungs, causing severe and sudden asthma attacks. Now, for people who already had asthma, this was catastrophic. But even perfectly healthy people found themselves gasping for air, overwhelmed by the sheer density of this microscopic pollen. The storm had essentially made the air everybody in Melbourne was breathing deadly. As for Jody Santoro, she would spend days in the ICU, hooked up to monitors, with machines pumping oxygen into her lungs while her body fought to heal. But she was lucky. She would eventually recover. And in the days that followed, she would learn the full scale of what actually happened in Melbourne. Nearly 10,000 people had flooded the hospitals across Australia, complaining of the same symptoms that Jody did. And unfortunately, of those 10,000, 10 people actually lost their lives, and many of them were totally healthy and had never had an asthma attack in their lives before. For Jody, despite surviving this ordeal, the awful memory of what happened on that night will forever be on her mind. She is now all too aware of how fragile life can be and how quickly things can change. The next and final story is called All in Their Heads. On a sunny afternoon in the summer of 1953, a young woman named Anne stood in the middle of a huge sugarcane grove in an isolated forest in Papua New Guinea. And around her were all her relatives and neighbors, and they were all there to mourn the loss of Anne's sister, whose name was Ton. She had passed away 3 days earlier from a very mysterious illness that people in Anne's village called kuru. And in their language, the word kuru meant trembling. Now, keep in mind, this particular mystery illness that was called kuru only affected the people in Anne and Ton's village. This is like a hyper-specific illness that only happened inside of this little forest to these people. But Anne and the rest of the people in her village had seen this happen over and over and over again every year, and so they knew what happened when you got kuru because it was always the same. As soon as you began to tremble, that was kind of like the first sign. 1 year or so after that moment, you lose control of all the muscles in your body until you die. And so in Ton's case, so Anne's sister, she had watched this happen exactly as it did for everybody else that ever got this illness. She started with the tremors, and then before long, she couldn't even stand up or walk around. And then finally, her sister lost control of the muscles in her throat, and so she couldn't eat despite being hungry. And so ultimately, she died of starvation, which is like one of the worst ways to die. It's incredibly slow and very, very painful. And so ever since Ton's death 3 days earlier, the village had been performing all these rituals and prayers in an attempt to assist Ton's spirit on its way into the afterlife. And this type of very involved funeral was absolutely customary in Anne's culture. Anne and her family and all of these villagers were members of the Foray people, who were native to Papua New Guinea, which is an island just north of Australia. And in 1953, when the story is taking place, the Foray people numbered about 11,000 people. And remember, they live in a very isolated forest. They are basically cut off from the world for the most part. But they were beginning to fear that they were going to go extinct because of kuru. Every year, the Foray people lost 200 people to kuru. And for the most part, the victims were women, like disproportionately so, which made it even more likely that the 4A people would go extinct, because if you lose all the women, you can't have any more kids. And in fact, by 1953, so many women had died from Kuru that by this point, there were 3 times as many men as there were women. In fact, the leading cause of death for 4A women was Kuru. But the 4A people did not view Kuru as just an illness. They actually viewed it as a curse. In fact, that was completely accepted that that is exactly what it was. This is not like getting the cold. Somebody did this to you. Like a sorcerer somewhere, some unnamed sorcerer that's like coming into the forest is targeting these women and cursing them with Kuru. And so the 4A people put on these really elaborate funerals, mostly to ward off these dark magic sorcerers that were casting Kuru spells. And so the 4A people believed that if they just nailed the funeral procedure for somebody who has just died from Kuru, the kind of 3-day long, all these rituals and prayers they have to do, if the village is able to nail it perfectly, then the deceased who's passed away from Kuru, so in this case on Sister Tawn, her spirit, as a result of this perfect funeral, would be able to kind of rise up and actually seek revenge on the sorcerer who killed the person. And so these funerals were basically like kind of taking the dead, rising their spirit, and sending them off to go kill the sorcerer. And so An and the rest of her villagers, they went through this very elaborate process for An's sister, Tawn, and at the end of it, they did feel like they had really nailed it. And so they felt confident that Tawn's spirit was going to rise up and get her revenge. A few weeks after An's sister's funeral, An was standing over an open fire, and she was cooking some pork and sweet potatoes, and as she went to flip the meat over, she reached her hand out, and she noticed her hand was trembling, which is the first sign of someone with Kuru. Now, An told herself that, oh no, I don't have Kuru, it's just because I was working really hard today and I'm tired, like that's all it is. But she knew deep down, she may have been cursed. An did her best to kind of hide her trembling hands. However, after about a month from that first time she noticed her hands shaking, she noticed she wasn't really able to stand up without kind of losing her balance because her legs were starting to tremble. And finally, when she basically couldn't even stand up without assistance, this is again only 1 month after that first tremble, she knew she had Kuru. And An already knew that there was absolutely nothing anybody in her village could do to stop this from killing her. Kuru was a 100% death sentence. And so if you got Kuru, it's like the whole village just began prepping for your death because they had to be ready to do this big ritualistic funeral. And so imagine that. You have this mystery illness or curse or whatever you want to think it is, and you're just counting down the days until you die. But for An, even though she had seen this happen so many times before and just kind of knew there's nothing she could do, she couldn't stand the idea of having this horrible, slow, painful death. And so she decided, you know what? I'm going to do something drastic that basically nobody else had done before who had Kuru. So for context, at this time, the 4A people had been totally isolated from other people in the world for thousands of years. They basically lived in this little part of Papua New Guinea in the forest, and nobody else contacted them. They were totally isolated. However, starting in the 1950s, some Australian colonists and researchers and police actually began kind of making their way in and around the 4A people's area. So they were making contact, albeit not necessarily direct contact, but the 4A people were seeing basically white people wandering around in and around their forest from time to time. And it was always very shocking when they would see these people because they dressed completely differently, they looked totally different. I mean, it's like two worlds totally colliding. And generally speaking, An and the rest of the people in her village, they did not like having these Australian people kind of wandering around. But An is thinking, you know, the people in my village, the 4A people, they have no solutions for me. So maybe these Australian people that have kind of popped up, maybe they have some answers about what I can do to stop myself from dying from this horrible curse. Keep in mind, by going out and seeking help from these outsiders, it was like An would be breaking a huge custom. This is so taboo for the 4A people, and very likely, even if she was able to find a solution from these outsiders, it's not clear if she would have been welcomed back into her village. And so this is a truly desperate measure she's taking, but she really felt like she had no choice. So, even as her body trembled from Kuru, An managed to stand up using a stick, and she began kind of hobbling her way quietly and discreetly out of her village. something that she really never did. And eventually, after hobbling her way out of sight of the 4A people, she began making her way through the woods, and she eventually came to a clearing where there was this house. And it was obvious this is not a house that the 4A people have built. This is somebody from the outside who's built something kind of near where they were living. And so An wandered up to this house, not really sure what to do, but she went up and knocked on the door. And a second later, it opened up. And it's this Australian anthropologist named Ronald Burnt, who actually An had seen before. He had been coming through her village a couple of times, attempting to interview people to learn more about the 4A people. She knew that nobody wanted to talk to him, but she had seen him before. And so she was relieved. This is someone that I'm somewhat familiar with. And so as Ronald is staring back at her, and Ronald's pretty tall and skinny, he's got glasses on, he's dressed like a typical Australian in the 1950s, and he's looking at An, and An begins to try to tell him what's going on with her. And as she began to talk, the words she was saying were coming out all garbled, and she realized that the Kuru curse was now affecting her throat, the muscles in her neck, and she was not able to speak. But as it happened, Ronald, who was very familiar with the 4A people, he could tell, based on just the way she was acting and how desperate she looked, that very likely this woman was here because she believed she had Kuru. And Ronald, who had learned about Kuru after studying the 4A people, he had done some research on it, and he believed it was entirely psychosomatic, that this was not an actual illness. Basically, he believed Kuru was acute hysteria, that these 4A people were just going crazy and convincing themselves that they had this illness, and I guess that kind of manifested their death a year later. And so Ronald interrupted An, who again is struggling to talk, and he was able to communicate to her in her language that you do not have Kuru, you are hysterical, this is in your head, and you should go now. And then he shut the door on her. And An had no idea what to do. She was embarrassed. She was terrified that maybe somebody from her village had seen her come out here. And so just trembling and feeling so alone and so scared, she turned around and just went back to her village. Nine months later, An's condition had severely deteriorated. She basically was following exactly the process of every other person she had seen with Kuru. She had lost virtually all the control of her body. She could barely sip water. She was feeling absolutely horrible. I mean, she knew she was closing in on death, and she had not gone back out to try to get help from outsiders. That interaction with Ronald had kind of destroyed her hope, and so she did go back and just was kind of waiting to die, just like everybody else in her village did. But for An, the physical symptoms of Kuru that she was experiencing were undoubtedly terrible, but they were not as bad, at least to An, as the other side of Kuru. So in addition to referring to this curse as Kuru, which meant trembling, sometimes 4A people would refer to this curse, this illness, as the laughing death. And it's because during the terminal stage, so the end stage of Kuru, when you're just about to die, you just begin laughing. It doesn't matter what you're thinking about. This is not an actual laugh. You're not thinking something's funny. It's like you could be weeping and totally depressed because you know you're going to die, but you keep hysterically laughing, which makes your whole body sore from constantly laughing over and over again. And An was beginning to experience that. She would be weeping and laughing at the same time. And think about this. Everybody else who's in the village, they know what this means. And so their preparations for her death are only getting more and more ramped up. They're getting ready for the big ritualistic funeral they're going to give to An. And so An, as she's hysterically laughing, is fully aware that everybody's just waiting for her to die. And finally, just a few weeks after she had begun the laughing side of Kuru, An would pass away, almost exactly 1 year from when she first noticed the trembling in her hand when she was cooking over that fire. After An's death, more and more people just kept on getting Kuru. And over the next 7 years, it was like clockwork. 200 plus 4A people died from Kuru every year, and nobody had any idea how to stop it. It just became a part of their lives. And again, they kept getting closer and closer to being extinct. It was this really terrifying time. Seven years after An's death, so in 1961, a medical anthropologist named Shirley Lindenbaum was sitting in her office at City University in New York, reading over old scientific articles. And as she was just kind of flipping through them, she noticed there was an article from an Australian anthropologist named Ronald Burnt. the same guy who had turned on away and told her, no, you don't have Kuru, that's not real, it's psychosomatic. And in this article, Ronald outlined these symptoms that the 4A people were exhibiting that obviously were not real. They had tremors, loss of muscle control, and huge mood swings. But Ronald was like, it's all in their head. It's not a real disease. But to Shirley, as she's reading this, she's thinking, why has Ronald decided this has to be psychosomatic? These symptoms seem like a real disease, like a neurological condition. Something must be attacking their brains, causing them to have these symptoms and then die. But when Shirley, just out of curiosity, began to do some additional research on the Kuru disease, or whatever you want to call it, she discovered that there was basically no real research other than Ronald's about this weird illness. And so she decided, you know what, there's a gap in the research, and I'm going to fill it. I'm going to figure out what's going on with the 4A people and this weird thing called Kuru. So, the following summer, when Shirley finally had some time, she left New York and flew to Papua New Guinea, and she made her way into the forests to contact the 4A people. And eventually, she reached some of these small villages that contained 4A people, and the 4A people, even if they didn't necessarily embrace Shirley, many of them were open to at least speaking to her and talking about their culture, their customs, their history, and of course, talking about Kuru, this curse. And eventually, Shirley made her way into this one particular 4A village where she actually saw a white man just walking around in this village. So he really stood out. And so immediately, Shirley walked up to this guy, and he introduced himself as Dr. Michael Alpers, and he told Shirley he had been living in these villages with the 4A people for several months because he was studying Kuru. He wanted to figure out, what's actually causing it, because he also felt very skeptical at the idea that this is just psychosomatic. That did not seem very plausible. And so Shirley and Dr. Alpers were totally aligned, and they're like, hey, let's swap notes and do this together. And so Shirley began telling Dr. Alpers about what she had learned so far, and she said that when she showed up in Papua New Guinea, she believed what Kuru was a genetic brain disease, meaning it would be passed down from, parent to child and so on and so forth. But she quickly discovered that after conducting research and talking to the 4A people in these villages, that was not the case. This was not something that went from parent to child. Instead, Kuru appeared to spread amongst tight-knit social groups within these villages, which seemed to indicate this was actually a contagious disease, not a genetic one. And so she told Dr. Alpers that now her working theory was that Kuru was actually a contagious type of encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain. But Shirley also said to Dr. Alpers that did not explain why so many victims of Kuru were female. And Shirley also said to Dr. Alpers that, I've been around loads of people with Kuru, and I don't have it, so how can it be contagious? Dr. Alpers agreed with everything Shirley was saying, and in fact had come to a similar conclusion himself, which meant he also had the same questions. Why only women, and why wasn't he getting it? But he told Shirley that when he began trying to answer this question, he discovered that actually, in addition to lots of women getting Kuru, also lots of kids got Kuru. Not necessarily parent to child, but also children in these villages seemed to be slightly more susceptible to getting Kuru than men. And in fact, Dr. Alpers told Shirley that right now there was a 12-year-old boy who was in the final stage of Kuru, so the laughing stage, the terminal stage, and because this boy's parents knew their son was going to die, they were so desperate and grief-stricken that when Dr. Alpers came by and offered to do an autopsy on their son when he passed to try to learn more, the parents agreed, even though that meant totally breaking 4A custom. So this was like major taboo decision. But again, the 4A people are getting more and more desperate as they go closer and closer to the brink of extinction from Kuru. A few days later, Dr. Alpers found Shirley, and he told her that the 12-year-old boy had passed away, and so now it was time to conduct the autopsy. And so he led Shirley to a clearing in the woods that was kind of far away from the eyes of the villagers, and there was a makeshift autopsy table with this boy's body on it. And while Shirley really could not stand to watch this actually happen, she did go over after Dr. Alpers had opened up the boy's skull, revealing his brain. And he yelled to her, hey, you have to come over here and look at this. And so Shirley walked over and she looked down, and even though she had not seen a human brain before right in front of her, she knew right away there's something terribly wrong with that brain. His brain was completely shriveled up and covered in holes, as if like a worm had drilled through his brain. And so Shirley and Dr. Alpers immediately knew this brain has to be sent off for further testing because something's happening here that's not psychosomatic. This is a real disease that is killing these people. About a year later, Shirley was back home in New York in her office when she received a letter from a research team at the United States National Institutes of Health, or NIH for short. And the NIH is one of the largest medical research facilities in the world. And it was where Shirley and Dr. Alpers had sent off that boy's brain for further study. And so by getting this letter, Shirley knew she was going to get information about whatever they discovered in this boy's brain. And so she ripped it open and pulled out the report and began reading. And the researchers said they had spent the last year, studying this brain tissue. And while they still didn't really understand how Kuru even happened and what caused it, was it a virus or an infection? They didn't know, but they had discovered something about how Kuru spread. During one of their experiments, the NIH researchers had injected some tissue from this boy's brain into a chimpanzee, and very quickly, that chimpanzee developed Kuru. And so this told the researchers that yes, Kuru was contagious and it spread through infected brain tissue. But how one person's infected brain got into another person's brain was the big mystery. But at least they had found something. But as Shirley read this, because she had done all that research when she went into the forests of Papua New Guinea and spoke to all these 4A people, she had learned a lot about what they did on a day-to-day basis and, what their various customs and rituals were. And she actually knew exactly how something like this could happen, something that only the 4A people were doing. During her research in Papua New Guinea, Shirley had learned that 4A people believe all humans have 5 distinct souls. There was that one soul that 4A people believed they could basically summon up out of a deceased person that would then go avenge that person's death. So think about how all those people who died from Kuru, they believed that was a curse from some sorcerer. And so a big part of that funeral process was to call out that soul to go avenge their death, go find the sorcerer and kill them. But that was just one soul. There were 4 others. And of these 4 others, there was one called the Quila, which was the most dangerous. Quila meant flesh in the 4A people's language, and this soul was like a manifestation of death and decay, because that's what our flesh does. It just kind of gradually dies all the time. And so they looked at the flesh as being a really bad thing. And so they believed after someone died, their flesh needed to be stored properly. Otherwise, it would pollute the air and cause more death and decay for other people that were still alive. And the safest place, according to the 4A people, for the Quila to be stored, so human flesh, was inside of a woman's body. And the reason for this is 4A people believe women's bodies are much more resilient than men's, and so if anybody could withstand holding Quila inside of them, it would be the women. But there was a very specific process that the 4A women had to follow in order to kind of put this Quila inside of themselves. And multiple 4A women had explained this totally bizarre process to Shirley when she was out there talking to the people in the village. The way it worked is a few days after a 4A member has passed away, this huge feast is prepared. Except the feast only consists of the Quila. Basically, the person who is dead is chopped up and prepared by the women, like their entire body gets consumed. Now, keep in mind, anybody hearing about this who's not a member of the 4A people would be like, oh my god, that's horrible. But to 4A people, this ritualistic cannibalism was actually an act of love. The idea was, by having these women consume the Quila, consuming the dead person, you're protecting the living, because you don't want the Quila out and about polluting the air, and you are respecting the dead. But remember, Kuru got spread through infected brain tissue. And it just so happened that during these funeral feasts, when they were consuming the Quila, the brain of the deceased person was an absolute delicacy. And so the brain was reserved for close female relatives of the deceased person. And so during An's sister's funeral, so when Ton passed, what do you think An ate? She ate Ton's brain. And then also, critically, Shirley had learned that a lot of these women who were given the brain, this delicacy during these funerals, they would often sneak little pieces of the brain and hand it out to kids as like a little treat. They would take the brain and eat it. Nobody knew. That's why the kids were also getting Kuru. And so a few years after this incredible discovery by Shirley about how Kuru was being passed along, the Australian colonial government banned the practice of ritualistic cannibalism in Papua New Guinea. Basically, they were telling the 4A people to stop eating the dead. It's what's killing you. And the 4A people, who were very desperate to stop being killed by Kuru, they took to it, stopped eating each other, and so Kuru was virtually eradicated, and the 4A population, instead of sliding towards extinction, actually began to grow really fast. And today, the total population has at least doubled. And also, just to close this out, one final note is it took until 1990 to actually figure out what was going on inside of these people's bodies when they had Kuru. Because back in the 60s, when they figured out how not to get Kuru, nobody understood what was even happening. It was just like, don't eat other people and you'll be okay, but that's all they knew. And while the process in the human body that caused Kuru remained a mystery for many decades after Shirley's big discovery, in the 1990s, researchers did finally figure out what's actually going on. Basically, somebody with Kuru has these proteins in their brain called prions that fold wrong into the wrong shape and then cannot function properly. This loss of protein function rapidly kills brain cells, which in turn shrivels up the brain and causes all those holes all over it. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballen podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. This special episode is brought to you by our friends over at Audible. If you're watching or listening to this right now, I know you are someone who craves stories that challenge what you think is possible. Stories that make you think, that keep you on the edge of your seat. And those are the exact types of stories I'm going to be talking about in today's episode. But before we get into this special episode, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of their vanilla ice cream with unsalted butter. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's episode.
Welcome everyone to the live recording of Wondery's Mr. Ballen podcast, presented by Audible. Please welcome your host, John Allen, and special guest, Evan Allen.
Thank you all for being here tonight. I had a chance to meet many of you before the show, Amy, a repeat offender. She was at our show in North Carolina. There's other folks that were at the New York City show. It's wonderful to see you guys come out here tonight. This is a really cool thing. We've never done a show like this. We've just basically done like the live tour, and we're trying to experiment with some new concepts. This is you guys getting to see it first. Also, this is being recorded. It's going to be dumped across social media, so that's cool. You guys get to be a part of that. But anyways, you all basically know me for the most part. I'm John, Mr. Ballen. Yep, and I tell stories for a living. I sort of fell backwards into this. And what people don't know is that, early on when I first started, it really was just me. I was just telling stories. But then fortunately, my very talented sister, Evan Allen here, who happens to be a Pulitzer Prize winning writer. She came along, and she actually jumped in and is now leading the creative side of Ballen Studios. So it's funny, like working with my sister, because we grew up like best frenemies, and now we're working together here at Ballen Studios. It's incredible, and she is. Although it's sort of seemingly nepotistic that my sister's working with me, the truth is Evan is vastly superior at researching and writing and frankly storytelling in its purest form, like written story. Well, its purest form, since this is an Audible event. It's spoken word, but Evan's incredible. So, but tonight we're here, and thanks to Audible for sponsoring this event. Let's hear it for Audible. Yep. Good. So tonight we're going to be doing a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to be getting into literally how we go about choosing stories, how we tell stories. We're going to rattle off some stories. It's going to be a whole storytelling thing, but we're going to get pretty tactical at certain points. And so that's sort of how we came to collaborate with Audible on this, because Audible and Ballen Studios share the same passion, bringing great stories to life via the spoken word. That's spot on. I've been memorizing that line for hours.
He says that every day.
So let's start by. We actually have a specific story we wanted to look at first. So Audible has this really cool book club, right? And Evan, why don't you take it away? So that there's a story in the book club. It's a true crime title that we were tasked with looking into and sort of dissecting and talking about up here. And why don't you tell us about what we chose and what you think of that story?
Okay, so hi everybody. Sorry, I'm really not doing well with the microphone. They spent so long.
I'm also hitting the microphone.
They got it just right, and I immediately just knocked it with my arm.
Yeah.
So we listened to the audiobook, The Debutante.
The Debutante.
Debutante.
We were arguing about how to say it. How do you say debutante? Seriously, I actually don't know how to say it.
I do know how to say it.
I know how to read it.
It's debutante.
That's why she's here.
So the book, The Debutante, the audiobook, it is an investigative sort of podcast audiobook by John Ronson, who, if you don't know him, he's a really great investigative reporter who writes about sort of fringe, people on the fringes. And sometimes this is extremists, sometimes it's, people who do or believe really horrible things, but sometimes it's also sort of outcasts. Like a book that I read by him was So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which was really interesting. It was about people who got canceled when canceling first became a thing. And so we chose the book in part because I just like John Ronson. But the
big John Ronson fan.
Huge.
Obsessed.
But this audiobook is about the Oklahoma City bombings, which happened in 1995. It was the biggest or the deadliest act of homegrown terrorism in American history, where Timothy McVeigh and two buddies from the military blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City, and it killed 168 people, including 19 children. And so this happened in 1995. I was a little bit surprised to see that there was an audiobook about it, because I remember it because I was 9 when it happened, and there were child victims. And so I just remember being there were pictures all over the news, and it sort of sticks out in my memory. But it was 30 years ago now, so I didn't really know why there was an audiobook about it. But John Ronson is investigating this theory that is sort of kicked around among people who know anything about the Oklahoma City bombing that Timothy McVeigh did not work alone. Now, he had 2 accomplices who also went to prison, but the idea is that, like, was it possible for the federal government to have known that he was going to blow up this building? And there are people who believe yes, and that is because of the debutante. And so the debutante. And so the debutante was this young woman named Carol Howe, who was literally a debutante, like with the dresses and like you come down the stairs. But then she did not like being a debutante, so instead she became a Nazi. Feels like a sharp left.
These are natural progressions, guys.
Trying to do this efficiently. And then she became an informant for the federal government. And she was informing on this sort of white nationalist movement, which people think maybe Timothy McVeigh was sort of like circling around. So the whole audiobook is John Ronson's pursuit of this question. Like, if the feds had listened to Carol Howe, could they have prevented the Oklahoma City bombing? And so it's super engaging. But, you know, when we think about story at the studio, we think about, you know, you always need a character on a quest. And in this case, the quest is John Ronson's quest to find the answer. And it's a really murky world that he is reporting in. Like, I mean, he's interviewing white nationalists. He's interviewing people who lived in this very strange, like, militia town. He's interviewing very unreliable narrators. And so you kind of go with him on this journey to talk to all these people. Like, he's hunting a conspiracy theory by talking to all these people who believe in conspiracy theories, and he's trying not to fall down like a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. So anyways, it was great. It's a great book. It's a really interesting book, but, you know, part of the reason I think that we're talking about it and talking about, like, that looks really natural. That's
yeah, this chair's throwing me off, dude.
Yeah, there's actually no way to sit comfortably in these chairs,
right.
But yours is worse.
Yeah, I'm trying to be natural.
You're not.
And I spilled water as well.
But anyway, so we were sort of looking at it. We're thinking about it in terms of, I mean, this whole evening is just thinking about how do we tell stories? What is a good story? What makes a good story? And so, you know, for me, the debutante it has a great quest.
But wouldn't you also say that, like, one of the things that you said to me when you finished it was this notion of surprise being a big part of that story and why it stood out to you?
Yeah, well, you know, the Oklahoma City bombings feels to me like a closed chapter of history when I think about it. I mean, I don't think about it very often, but it happened a long time in the past. I don't really have a lot of questions about it, or I didn't. And so what I liked the most about this book was that it's a super surprising look at something I thought I knew. And I think in part of the reason it works well told in this format, like spoken, you get to hear from the people who lived it, is because the stories they have to tell are so wild that if you had like a single narrator trying to write it out, you might not believe them. I felt like I got through the book, I got like halfway and I was like, oh, I have really strong feelings about what I think now. And then I got another quarter of the way and I was like, no, I have the opposite set of strong feelings. So yeah, I always like stories like that give you like a new perspective on something that you thought you knew.
Right. Actually, so maybe on that note, so the debutante, definitely check that title out. It's a fantastic audiobook on Audible. You know, the idea of there being a reversal or a change of perspective at the end of a story is so central to just the way we produce stories at Ballen Studios. When I look back at sort of how this all came to be, you know, it started on TikTok. I tried my hand at some dancing and some other things of that ilk, and it didn't land, which was shocking. But sort of as a last-ditch effort, and what I mean by last-ditch, I just decided social media wasn't for me. I told a story, and it was about these hikers that went missing in the 1950s. I've told this story a million times. I'll shorten it for the sake of this. It's the Dyatlov Pass mystery. And I think it's fascinating. Effectively, 9 hikers in the 50s who were super skilled. They go out into the Ural Mountains, which is this totally rugged terrain, and they're trying to pass their level 3 hiking test, which seems pretty mild, but it's actually like a really big deal. In the 1950s in Russia, this was like the equivalent of being like a master mountaineer. And these 9 hikers were truly like the best mountaineers in Russia at the time. And they set out, I like how I said I was going to truncate this story, immediately not doing that.
I want to know more about the level 3. Is there a level 4?
Maybe we should get into that. But they set off on this quest to do this hiking test, and really all it was is they needed to go through the Ural Mountains. They had chartered a course that would take several weeks, and it's like, okay, do the course that you've set. And if you successfully navigate this course in the times you've given, that demonstrates your ability to be a level 3 hiker. And off they go, and they take cameras with them, and they take photos and videos. And imagine these 9 hikers, they're like all in their 20s, with the exception of a few of them. They're all like young, inspired, they're hungry, and they disappear. Like within a couple of days, they've lost contact with the hikers, and lots of people were aware of the fact this test had begun. There was actually an entire protocol for what happens if the hikers don't reach their checkpoints. And basically, it's the military gets called, and they go across their path to see if they can find them. And so that's what happens. The military figures out after like a week that they're missing, and they basically go in reverse because they're at the back end of the course. They're going in reverse, and they find their way up to this mountain. And immediately they see on this windswept, snow-covered mountain, about halfway up, there's a couple of small canvas tents. And there's no people. They just see them on the side of the mountain. And immediately it's this huge red flag, because if you're a skilled mountaineer, there's one place you don't put your tent, and it's on the leeward side of the mountain where you're going to get destroyed by wind. You either go to the top and go to the other side, or you make it up halfway and it's getting too late, the storms aren't, it's too bad up here, you go back down. You never stop halfway. And so they see them halfway up the mountain. It doesn't make any sense. They make their way up to the tents, and they find that they're all missing. The 9 hikers are gone, but the tents have been cut open from the inside. They've been cut open with what appears to be a knife, almost like with precision. And then inside the tent, a lot of their clothing was left behind. It was folded up neatly in the corner. Now, this is like the dead of winter. This is like not a time to be ditching your winter clothes. And they found there were also footprints in the snow going down the mountain from the campsite. And they noticed that lots of the footprints, and they found all 9 hikers were accounted for in these footprints. But many of the prints were bare feet, or one shoe and barefoot on the other. And so the military follows the prints down to the base of the mountain, and there's this copse of trees that's maybe like half a mile away from where the tents were, and they find 3 of the hikers, and they're all basically nude or close to nude. They're deceased. There's one of the hikers who's basically like dangling over the branches of a tree up high, and there's 2 others that are down on the ground, and there's these deep gouge marks in the tree, almost like an animal had been like clawing at this tree. But this is the middle of nowhere. There really are no animals out here. So they're just deceased. The footprints continue from where they are another, mile or so to the snowdrift that sort of created a pseudo cave, like a snow cave. And inside of that cave, they find the remaining hikers, who are also all deceased. And the women were wearing men's clothes and vice versa. Not entirely, but they had sort of exchanged bits of clothing. There were trace levels of radiation on several of them. One of the women, she had her nose, her lips, and her ears. It looked like they had been surgically removed. And this is not, so far into them being missing that you would expect animal predation at this point. This is pretty early on in them being missing. So it's surprising that would happen. One of the gentlemen, his chest they described this catastrophic chest injury, where basically his chest was caved in, but there was no impact on the outside. Like there's no bruising, nothing on his chest. Just his chest had the effects of like a train hitting him. And they're all pushed inside of this cave, and they're all deceased. And so naturally, the families are, they're beside themselves when they find out this has happened. How could this have happened to all? What happened to them? And so the government launches this investigation into what happened, and they begin to dig into it. And it actually made the news. It was a pretty big deal at the time. People were closely following the story, and abruptly, the Russian government stopped the investigation and came out and said an unknown, unnatural force was responsible for their deaths. Case closed. And there are pictures, there's testimony, there's all these weird things about this story, and it's been one of those enduring mysteries that I thought was really interesting. And I managed to tell that in a 60-second clip that was very rough on TikTok. And it went viral, went super viral on TikTok. And I didn't really know what to do with it. So I just kept sort of posting more stories that were like that, because I, at the time in my life, I'm fascinated by stories like that. And there's quite a few, believe it or not, that are like out there. Actually, you know that. You subscribe to the channel.
Believe it or not.
That's sort of the whole point. You won't believe this. But the reason I just did that is, one, I can't help myself, but two, there's something so simple about telling a good story. Like that story, everybody's waiting to, I'm taking some liberties here. Everyone's basically paying attention because they want to hear what happened. There's some sort of payoff at the end of the story. If you go, basically, this is not a dig on any other channel on YouTube, because there's loads of successful channels out there that do amazing content. But the next time you hear a story that's being presented to you, it can be a YouTube channel, a TV show, movie, it doesn't matter. Oftentimes, the first thing you hear is what happened. I'm going to tell you a story about the 9 hikers who all died in mysterious ways, and they were found with trace levels of radiation, and their faces were cut off, and it was totally crazy. And back on 1954, they started their journey. And it's like, that's fine. I mean, that's a type of storytelling that's perfectly acceptable. And Evan, coming from the Boston Globe, that's a traditional reporting. She was a big-time investigative journalist, won multiple Pulitzer Prizes, no big deal. But news, it's like, here's what happened, and then here's the narrative. If you want to draw people into a story, it's about having payoff at the end and being ruthless about not giving it up at all before you get to the end. This is a good time to turn it over to you, Evan. So Evan writes, researches. She's got an incredible team. Evan is the stories you're hearing that I'm telling on the internet. Evan has found those and put them together. Evan is the brilliant mind behind the scenes. The amount of work that goes into ensuring we do not give up information too early is staggering. And so with that, Evan, I want to talk about your role and how you go about selecting stories. And maybe touch on our childhood and what led us to this moment.
That was good.
Just put that all in there,
We had
dude.
like a framework, and as you can see, Johnny is remembering late.
I forgot.
Yeah. That's okay. So we're going to naturally now segue into our childhood.
Yeah, right.
And what made us
And then we'll come back
storytellers.
to the thing. And we're making sure there's payoff at the end.
This is part of it. We're doing like a whole meta thing. So what am I talking about?
Well, so what I should have said before I went sideways is, Evan and I grew up in the same house. We are related, and we literally were like raised to be storytellers. It's like unintentionally.
Yeah,
and you have a great anecdote about our mom, who also works for the studio as well. She's a pioneer for writing the podcast. She was like a walking audiobook, and that's not even a plug for Audible. It's like facts. Like, what was it? A library card. What was it?
When we were growing up, my mom was very she's kind of a hippie. No TV. We got to watch a half an hour or an hour of Masterpiece Theater on Saturdays.
Good day.
So that was like big. But the rest of the week we were kind of on our own. But she read to us all the time, and she also took us to the library all the time. We actually had, for a while, the highest circulating library card in the city of Quincy, which makes you popular at school. But she read to us all the time, for an hour and a half at night. So it was kind of like growing up with a human audiobook. And so it's funny, we sort of went in very different directions. You
didn't become a Navy SEAL?
I did not. I didn't become a Navy SEAL. But it's fun. I mean, we came from the same place. We learned how to speak English from the same people, where our family is full of people who talk and tell stories. I remember my dad read The Call of the Wild to us when we were 5 and 7. And I think he thought that because it's about animals, it's about dogs, that it was for kids. But in fact, I'm not going to spoil anything, but many of the dogs die. And my mom got really upset with him because we were both hysterical at the death of one of the dogs.
Still hurts today, honestly. It's deep trauma.
But yeah, so we grew up, reading was just a huge central part of our childhood, really, because we were deprived of television. Yeah. But then you became a Navy SEAL. I went into reporting, and it didn't seem, I would not have predicted that we would work together. Yeah. But I mean, even in the military though, what was your nickname? Shakespeare? Because you were always telling people stories?
Yeah. Yep. Actually, so in the Navy, so when you become a Navy SEAL, there's a lot of hazing that happens, and one of the ways they haze you is they like make you give these ridiculous speeches that you don't know they're ridiculous, but everybody else does. Like you're a new guy, you've checked into the team, and like they're like, all right, dude, you got to give this brief to like all these commanders over here. And you're like, really? This seems irrelevant to brief them about like the ballistics of like this plastic round. They're like, no, get in there and do this. And so you go into this room that's not just the commanders of the team, it's like all the senior personnel and you, the brand new guy. And so you like would have to go up there and give a presentation that oftentimes you don't have any information for. They're like, yeah, just go up there and do it. And I would just default to telling stories about things that didn't really have much to do with what I was supposed to be presenting, but it got me through the presentations. And they liked it a lot. They liked that I would tell these stories. And so it became like, John, tell a story. And so I became Shakespeare in the Navy.
But I mean, at a certain point, what you got me to come work with you, I was just helping because you're my brother, and it was a pretty small team at first. But as I did more and more of it, I realized that, even though I think I come from legacy media, I worked at the Boston Globe, I was an investigative reporter, we can be slightly snobby about YouTube. But I realized that it's like this very sort of elemental form of storytelling. It's like sitting around a campfire. I think there's something, I mean, I have a 6-year-old, she's here.
Shout out, Dylan.
But she's always saying to me, like, tell me a story. It's like this very, like, it's like instinctive in us to want to hear stories, to want to tell stories. And I feel like the type of storytelling that we do, and good storytelling, any kind of good storytelling, it has like some fundamental elements to it. And, that's character, that's quest, that's also, I love in our stories, there's always like a surprise at the end. There's sort of like a twist. We refer to it in the studio as the twist and the reveal. Like the twist is, here's what's really been going on this whole time. It suddenly becomes apparent. And the reveal is like the truth of the situation. And it works really well. That's what makes our stories, if you think about them, they're all constructed heading towards the twist and the reveal. But that's not something that we created. I mean, if you read, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but just bear with me, because when I get to the end of it, it's going to come together. If you read Aristotle's Poetics, which is like his treatise on storytelling. Legacy media.
So snobby.
He talks about the climactic moment of reversal and recognition. And that's just the twist and the reveal. And I say that not because I feel like I'm like Aristotle, I'm not, but because these are sort of like fundamentals, like the fundamentals of good storytelling.
Oh, I got one. To show Evan's prowess, I'm going to tee you up for something. You're going to tell a story, they're going to love it. Initially, the reason that Evan really succeeded at coming in and writing for me was not just that she was an incredible writer, because she was. But she also knew me. She grew up with me and knew how to write in my voice. And so she was like amazing at being able to write for me. But the thing is one of the things that I demanded was you have to find stories that have a twist at the end. That's what you got to do. You got to find stories with twists. But the reality is just about every story can have a twist if you're a good enough writer. Okay, so like what I was doing is I was literally looking for stories, like Googling what story has a twist. And I was like doing those. And Evan took it a step further, and she's like, you have to think about things like the unreliable narrator or like sleight of hand when you're writing. And I'm like, I don't really know what you mean. But there's a great example that you have that it's entirely Evan's construction, and you might as well just riff it off right now. It's the one, the African one.
Oh.
This is like, as you're listening to her go through the story, just like think about what this could be. And some of you may have already heard this story. It's okay, keep it to yourselves, okay? But think about like the device that's being used. When you get to the end of the story, you'll realize that a very intentional thing has happened that's totally by design. And you'll see at the end as well that other people screw the story up all the time when they try to tell it. So now just nail it, dude.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Setup. So a man in Cameroon wakes up in the morning just feeling like crap. And he doesn't know why he feels like crap. He remembers the night before was a normal night. It was definitely raining. He heard thunder. He had kind of a headache, so he went to bed. Now he wakes up and there's something off, but he can't identify what it is. So he decides he needs to go find someone. He needs to find help, but he doesn't really even know why. So he gets out of bed. He goes out of his house. His house is on sort of like the edge of a cliff. It's like a high up, and there's a lake below it. And then on the other side of the cliff, lower down, is the town. So he starts going to the town to find help. And he gets about halfway down, and he realizes that it's very quiet. It's like weirdly quiet. Because like this is a place where you can hear the baboons barking, you can hear the bugs, you can hear the birds. This is a loud place full of nature, and it is silent. There are no baboons, there are no birds, there are no bugs, there's nothing. Doesn't know what to make of this, freaks him out, but he just keeps going. And so he gets to the low, like the edge of the water, and he's heading towards the town, and he sees this woman. And it's a woman that he knows. She lives right at the edge of this lake, and she and her family tend to goats. And so he sees her, and he wants to ask her for help, but he realizes that she's screaming. And she's screaming, and she's surrounded by what looked to him just like her family members who are sleeping. But as he gets closer, he realizes that her family members are too still to be sleeping. And he realizes that this woman is screaming because her family members are dead. So he doesn't ask her for help. But he continues on to the village, and as he's going into the village, he's seeing cattle and goats and livestock just like dead around. And when he gets to the village, he starts going door to door looking for help. And every door he opens, the people are everyone's dead. They just dropped where they stood. And so he finally manages to make it out of the village and go for help. And actually no one believes him at first. Eventually someone does believe him, and they come and they find that like almost 2,000 people. I'm not sure that we actually even know exactly the number,
Significant.
But a huge number of people just died. They just died like where they were standing. And, it causes all of the government comes and scientists come and people try to figure it out. And it turns out that the night before, what he thought was thunder was actually an explosion or some kind of rock slide, but it was some kind of large disruption that caused the lake, which was a crater lake. And so it's sitting on like an active volcano or near an active volcano. I'm not a scientist, to emit this carbon dioxide, like a huge bubble of carbon dioxide burst up out of the lake immediately after that, the crash that he thought was thunder. And remember, he lives on the edge of a cliff. Carbon dioxide is a little heavier. So the carbon dioxide went up, it made him sick, it gave him a headache, but it didn't kill him because it sank. It sank onto the town, and it killed almost everyone in the town. So that is the way that we tell the story at the studio. That is, we do it through point of view, we do it through omission. We're locked in this man's point of view. We can only know what he knows. So all he knows when he wakes up is he doesn't feel well, there was thunder last night, he starts getting down the side of the cliff and everything is quiet. Well, that's because the carbon dioxide killed all the birds and the bugs, but he doesn't know that. And so we like to tell stories in a way that like, we can only know what the characters know. That's what makes real life so scary. We all have to live in this liminal space where there's stuff that's going to happen to us and we don't know what it is yet. That's actually somewhat terrifying. All of our stories exist within that space, and the moment of reversal and recognition, or the twist and the reveal, whatever you want to call it, is the moment when the true nature of the world becomes apparent to us. And it is both shocking but inevitable when you look back on the clues that we lay through the story to get you there.
Picture this. You're alone in your car at the end of the night on your commute back home, and you're stuck in traffic, but you're completely absorbed in the story you're listening to on Audible. And actually, even though you're in traffic, you're kind of hoping that the traffic continues just so you can listen to one more chapter. That's what Audible does to you. Now, if you're anything like me, the type of story you might be totally engrossed in on that ride home would be one that sort of makes you question reality. I mean, that's sort of the whole point of my YouTube channel, is to sort of see what's out there and question it. Like, the whole world is a big mystery to me. Well, Audible is absolutely packed with stories like that make you question reality, and I love them. You can find anything and everything in their collection, from supernatural encounters to, people being stuck out in the wild, being pushed to their absolute limits, and everything in between. I mean, it's all there. Take, for example, the story called The Debutante. And it's the story about the Oklahoma City bombing in the 1990s. It was this huge, horrible thing. But a lot of people have a pretty fixed idea of what happened, what led to the bombing, how it happened, the outcomes. It's sort of like a closed chapter in history. But the debutante, it takes you into this world where you realize there's so much more to that bombing, to include maybe it could have been prevented. I mean, there's a lot of twists and turns, but it's a very surprising story. Just like all the other fascinating tales with crazy twist endings that are littered all across Audible's amazing collection. And the narrators of the audiobooks on Audible are incredible. They don't just read lines, they bring the stories to life. Plus, on Audible, there is a ton of exclusive content like Audible Originals and Audible Sleep Collection. So, if you're ready to experience stories that will transform your daily commute into a trip into the unknown, then you gotta try Audible. Trust me, once you start, there's no coming back. Start listening today when you sign up for a free 30-day trial at audible.com/Mr. Ballen. Again, that is audible.com/Mr. Ballen.
And so going back to sort of how I joked about the Dyatlov Pass story, that a lot of people, the way they would tell it is to lead with the fact that these hikers died in suspicious ways, and then you get into the story. I would challenge you to look up, it's called Lake Nyos, Nyos. If you look up the Lake Nyos disaster, virtually every time it's told, it's about this idea, like, can you believe it? The lake blew up and it caused carbon monoxide to kill all these people. But what we do, what Evan did masterfully with that story, is think about like who's experiencing this in real time and put yourself in that perspective. And so going back to this idea that like anything can have a twist, take like in a typical police investigation, like a homicide investigation, there's a pretty good chance that there are people who are going to get interviewed who are lying. Okay? But they do say the things out loud that seem relatively convincing. And if you were to inhabit their POV when they said it, you know as the writer they're lying. And you know it's going to be revealed later that they're lying. But you can, in all honesty, tell the story through their point of view at that point in the story, and it's honest storytelling. And it creates a setup to reveal that it turns out Joey was lying, he was the killer. So it's about the unreliable narrator is a really, really easy way to take virtually any story and create a twist. Just use somebody else's or actually Evan. So she was an investigative journalist and she covered crime. Like that was her MO in Boston. And Evan was telling me the other day in preparation for this that she would like be at crime scenes, and she's written about all these murders, like a shocking number of murders, and honestly, a very dark life, to be honest.
Thank you. Very dark life.
But she's like in some of the most dangerous parts of Boston where like murders have been committed. She's at the crime scene, like where someone has been shot and killed. So she's as primed as you can be to be like in tune with violence in your area. And she's described hearing gunshots at the crime scene, distant gunshots, but gunshots nonetheless. And she immediately thinks, oh, those are fireworks. This is someone who's at a homicide where someone was shot and killed, who sees this stuff all the time. But that's what humans do. They rationalize, because it's your brain, the way you think is when bad things happen, you actually immediately go into this hyperdrive of telling yourself everything is okay. This is too long of a story to get into, but I literally can't. It would take it 2 hours. Put everybody to sleep. So when I was 16, I had this experience out at this cabin in New Hampshire. It was one of the earliest stories I told on YouTube, where effectively over the course of several nights, I had either the most visceral, terrifying, living nightmare, like a sleepwalking scenario, I don't even know, where like this figure was basically walking around the cabin. This is not my origin story. It isn't like this happened and I became the storyteller. It's purely coincidental. But I had this horrifying experience as a 16-year-old where I'd be laying in bed in this cabin in New Hampshire up in the White Mountains, very isolated. It's dark. There's not even really any roads that go up there. And I'd be laying there and I would hear footsteps walking around the cabin. And then at some point, this figure walked into my room. Like 2 nights out of the 3, something walked into the room that is inexplicable to me, still have no answer for it, and sort of like bowed into the bed next to me and vanished. There's a much larger story to this. It's called What I Saw in My Room Still Haunts Me. You can look it up. But I can say firsthand that as I'm laying in bed as a 16-year-old kid, hearing footsteps walking around the cabin, clear as day, I am awake, I can hear footsteps, and no one's awake right now in the house that I'm aware of. There's no one coming to visit. And my first thought was, everything's fine. This is okay. I think that one of my friend's brothers could be coming by. It's 3:30 in the morning in the middle of nowhere in New Hampshire. they're probably stopping by to say hello. And what's going to happen here is they're going to come in here and they're going to want to talk to me, say hi, socialize. And so what I'm going to do is that when they come in here, I'm just going to pretend to be asleep because I don't want to have a social interaction right now at 3:30 in the morning. That's all I'm thinking about. Not there's a effing intruder in your house. That's a problem. No, my brain's like, everything's fine. All the way until something entered the room. And even then, as I'm staring at this tall, dark figure that has walked into the room that I can't make sense of, I'm still thinking to myself, is that Nick's brother? Right? And then like the next day, because there's this horrible night where I'm awake all night, like stressing about it, because it literally vanished into the floor next to me. And, in real life, that doesn't really happen. So I'm thinking, when's it going to stand back up again, whatever this thing is. The next morning, I'm talking to Nick's mother in the kitchen, and she's listening. I'm like telling her, like, did your son come by at some point last night? Like, what happened? And she's like, John, don't worry. I heard that last night too. It was my husband who was walking around here, her deceased husband. That's what she's telling me. And I'm like, oh, this is fine. This is okay. The story progresses to where it just happens for several nights and there's really no explanation. But I had like this point in my life where there isn't an explanation for what happened in that cabin. There isn't. I'm sure there is, but I don't have access to that information. It is unreal how much my brain was going into overdrive to convince myself everything was okay. It's automatic. It really is. And actually, just to get a little morbid, I had an experience in Afghanistan where when I was deployed, I was nearly killed by a grenade. And when the grenade came over the wall and we're like in the middle of this, like as intense of a gunfight as you can be in, I watched this grenade come over the wall and we were under the strobe light cast down on us from the plane overhead, and it's like flashing, and you can only see the light on infrared or on your nods. So it's pitch black to the average person, but to me, it's like a disco strobe, right? And a grenade is hurtling over the wall, and I'm seeing it absolutely. There's gunfire, there's all this stuff happening, but I see a grenade coming over the wall, and it's coming in and out of focus because the light's flashing on it. And it was so like matter of fact. Time did seem to slow down, which I guess when your body goes into you're about to die mode, it's like all your senses fire on a level that you really can't do, or you can't artificially do this. It's basically like in true fight or flight scenarios, your brain reacts differently. And so it gives the impression, a real impression of time slowing down. And so this grenade comes over the wall and it's like, I can see it, it disappears. It's just happening in a fraction of a second. The grenade comes over the wall, and all I thought was like, oh, fuck. The grenade is going to detonate next to my head, and I'm going to die, but I won't be able to have an open casket funeral. It was not even sadness. It was just facts. Shoot. Well, that's it. I'm about to die. I have my head blown off. It hits my shoulder. This is, again, in a fraction of a second, and it began to tumble towards the ground. And again, I can see it here, and when it made it to about my torso, it's just falling to the ground. I was like, oh, shoot, like, maybe my mom will be able to recognize me at my funeral. She'll see my face, thank goodness. And so it's not like, oh, I'm going to make it. It's just, oh, good, my face will be intact. But it kept on falling, and it reached my legs. And again, it's in a fraction of a second, but I was like, oh man, I might live through this. And then it detonated, and it felt like somebody threw rocks at me, and I wound up like in a surgery tent. It was quite the blur. But the point I'm making with that is, actually, I'll say, before I went up in the surgery tent, it blows up, I get dragged to cover, I'm in this alleyway, and we were in this village it was very kinetic, and it just meant people shot at us every time we went in there. And we were fighting with people that effectively had been saying over their radios, when we got there, we can listen to their radios, that they were all gonna fight to the death, which really means they're gonna shoot indiscriminately at you, even if it means targeting their own people. And so when a contact would break out, literally the town would or the fighters would begin shooting arbitrarily in your direction. Like they didn't care if they hit they're martyring their own people. And so like rockets are flying, and like tracers are coming, and tracers are rounds that you can see, like every fifth round or so, you can see the round. And I remember laying in this alleyway, bleeding to death. I couldn't get my tourniquets off to put on my legs to stop the bleeding. And it was just so matter of fact. The way you know how to live, like right now, all of us are doing it. You're all living, but you're not really thinking about living. You simply are. I don't know if this is comforting or horrifying. You know how to die too. In the moment when I was literally about to bleed out, I was very likely seconds away from just bleeding to death. All I thought in my head, well, there's a couple things. There's one sad. It's like, I wish I'd started a family. That's sad. But there was also just this weird, like nonchalant, specific thing that I was hung up on. I'm laying in this alleyway. I'm just like, I can't even see anymore. So I'm blind, I'm deaf, I'm in the void of my brain. And I remember thinking like, I wonder if it will say John Allen killed in action or Jonathan Allen killed in action. Pressing questions. But the point is, if you think about what I've just told you, those two stories about your brain operating in a way that you really can't control, think about all the people in the world over time who have been in horrifying situations, way worse than anything I just detailed, that have testimony. They have the things they saw. You can operate their perspectives if it's available to you and really live in that liminal space as you described, which is a really powerful place to be. If you write a story from that perspective, it's bizarre, it's detached from reality, but at the same time, it's exactly human. And so Evan is masterful at finding stories that have somebody that we call the unreliable narrator that went through an experience that they literally can't fully understand, like Evan not knowing it's gunshots. If we had told the story about Evan at the crime scene, we'd say, and then the reporter, she heard fireworks off in the distance, but we'd reveal later on it was gunshots. It applies to any story like that. And so Evan is masterful at finding stories like that. So that's a device that is useful for telling stories. Don't know where I was going with that.
That was good. No,
that's a good point.
You went where it had to go.
You know, I guess we could talk about the other one, which is sort of sleight of hand, which is like you want the caving one.
Yeah,
or take it, whatever you want to do.
No, I mean, I think sort of what we're sort of hoping to do is just sort of talk about some of the ways that we make the stories that we tell feel really engaging. I think one of my favorite things to see from viewers or listeners is when people say like, oh, I know this story, but I didn't realize I know this story until like halfway through. And that's because we're trying to tell it in a way that you haven't heard before. What you're talking about with sleight of hand is sort of we talk a lot. So we have like weekly writers meetings, and we use for inspiration like a huge number of things. Like every writers meeting, we talk about something. This past week, it was the opening scene of the Seinfeld episode, The Briss. Because the Seinfeld writers are really, really good at setting up each of the characters for the episode. They do it in this like very economical way. It's like so fast, it's so perfect. But if you watch that episode, I will not explain it to you now because it is too much to explain to you now, and it's Seinfeld, and that would just be weird. But they set up all the characters in the first like minute and 20 seconds for the whole episode, and it's just like a really great model of like economical storytelling. We looked at lots of sketch comedy. Sketch comedy is all about taking a scenario that seems like it's going to be familiar to the viewer and then sort of like flipping it on its head and using the viewer's own expectations against them. Like there was a Shane Gillis sketch where they're like in an airplane and the airplane is about to crash. And so we all know that story, right? It's like somebody comes out and they're like, oh, you have 10 seconds. Everybody call your loved ones. And so everybody in the plane and the sketch starts calling Mom. And so you don't even need to play any of what they say. It's like moves really, really fast until you get to Shane Gillis, who picks up his phone and he's like, hey, is this Frank's auto body? And that's funny because it like takes what you were expecting and it's like, it just flips it completely. So we look at stuff like that. We look at, we pull inspiration from everywhere, but one of the places is we talk a lot about like, where's the camera? Camera is zoomed really close in on moments of high tension or high suspense. We kind of zoom out when we need to like move a little quickly through something. So we're often we actually read a lot of like screenplays. Like if you read 1943's The Leopard Man, excellent screenplay. So one of the ways that we often obscure what a story is about so that when we get to the end, it feels like a surprise, but also inevitable because it can't just be a surprise, right? Because then it's like, well, that sucks. That's weird. Like if it just turns out to be some random thing, it's not cool. It has to snap everything that came before it into focus. And so one of the tricks that we use is we think of it as like zooming the camera really, really, really close in so you lose all the context. So like, you know, those there is a style of photography, but I don't know what it's called.
When you take a photo of
you
something
take a photo
so
of something
close.
super
Yeah.
close so it doesn't even look like itself. You'll be looking at it and you're like, is that the moon? And it's like, oh no, it's just a pebble, but they like magnified it 1,000 times. That's kind of what we do sometimes, where we'll be like, the camera will be really tight in on a character. And so you're seeing, I remember one story, we had 3 guys in a boat and they're doing something in that boat. And we're like really close in on what they're doing. They have like these strips of fabric that they're tearing apart, and they're making sure the strips of fabric are different lengths. And they're putting the fabric in a hat, and they're being like really, really serious about this activity. But to the viewer, it's like, why are we so focused on these strips of fabric? Like, why are these 3 guys in a boat? Like, we don't have any of that. We have 3 guys in a boat. We're looking at what they're doing. We're looking at their hands. The camera's real close. And so slowly they each pull a strip of fabric out of the hat. And then one of them looks at his strip of fabric and just starts crying. And it's revealed that they're basically drawing lots for who's going to get eaten because they're shipwrecked. But if you think about where the camera was while I was telling you that story, it was so close that you missed the wider context. And we do that a lot. And so I don't want to give away too many of our tricks here, but like,
Send
you
it,
can,
dude.
we're thinking very deliberately about what we're showing and what we're not showing. So POV is one way to hide a bunch of stuff, because characters often don't know what's happening, because as Johnny said much better than I can say it, you never really know what's happening when it's happening to you. It's only in retrospect that things look inevitable. But another way that we do it is just that sort of like so close that what we're saying is true, but it is disguising reality.
There was actually, I just thought of this one. This was unscripted, but I think it's a good one. Another example of zooming in really closely. So another good story that demonstrates this, although it's less severe, but it's a good one. So this actually is on our Instagram right now, and it's going pretty viral. So maybe you've seen it. Okay, so there's this guy and a girl who are on a first date in Utah. This is in the 1970s, and they're at a restaurant, and the date's not going very well. It's not going bad, but there's not any chemistry. And the guy, he just sort of thinks, this isn't probably going to go anywhere. This is the last time I'm going to see this person. So he sort of just says, hey, do you want to like just leave and do something else? I got a pretty good idea. Like, forget the restaurant. You want to go on a hike with me? I know there's like this overlook out in Provo Canyon. It's got a great view of the stars. Do you want to go do that? And the girl's like, okay, I'll do that with you. Like, suddenly this is exciting. Like, this boring date has now become sort of electric. Like, what are we getting into tonight? It's late, right? So they leave like the Waffle House, wherever they are. They hop in the car and they drive they drive to this parking lot, and it's nighttime, but the moon's out. There's some good illumination, and they park in this parking lot and they get out, and now it's like, it really is exciting. There's just something sort of crazy about how this night has turned. And so now there almost is chemistry. And so he's like, it's this way. You just go in the woods right here. And it's like out of a storybook, like or what's it, the Witch's Fables, what's it, Hansel and Gretel. Like, it's like this forest with like a cutout of like a pathway that leads into darkness. Like, this is a sort of foreboding trail they're going to go on. But he's like, I promise you just go down this trail and there's a great overlook. And so off they go down this trail, and it's a paved trail. And they're walking along, but it's really dark. And nobody else is out here on this trail. This is not the time to go hiking on this trail. But they're walking along, and remember, they're excited, but very quickly, and they would only know this after the fact, very quickly as they start walking down this trail, they both start to feel this intense sense of dread, but they don't know why. But they both begin walking faster because they have to get to the overlook. The overlook's, half a mile away or whatever it is, and they've committed to this, and this is supposed to be fun. And so down the trail they go. They start walking faster and faster. Neither is recognizing that they're going faster, but it's clear because they're holding each other's hands that there's tension. Something's wrong. And they make a turn around this corner. And suddenly the guy steps on something soft and comes to a dead stop. He doesn't look down at it. The girl has stopped abruptly with him. They're holding hands. They already know something's wrong. They haven't addressed it directly, but they know something's wrong. Without saying a word, without investigating, nothing. They turn around and speed walk out of there. And when they get out of the trail and they're back in the car, they're like, phew, oh my God, like, what was that? And they're like, oh, I don't know. Fast forward 10 years. 10 years later, those two actually did get married. It worked out great. The decision to go down the trail paid beautifully for them. And they're in their home, and the TV's on, and it's playing a news segment. And it's a reporter who is interviewing somebody on death row, and they're about to be executed. And they're giving this expose into their crimes. And they were asked, as the TV's playing, she's in the kitchen, he's in the living room. They asked this person, before you got caught, was there ever a time you almost got caught? And he said, yeah. I was in Provo Canyon back in the 1970s, whenever it was, and I had just killed this young girl, and I was dragging her across that trail out near Provo Canyon. And this couple comes storming around the corner, and the guy stepped on the body. And I'm crouched down next to the body, looking up at them, waiting to see what they're going to do. I would have had to kill them if they looked down and saw what was going on. But for some reason, they just turned around and they left. That couple had run into Ted Bundy. And it was one of the last people he killed, and he literally said, I would have killed them if they had simply looked down. So in that story, there's obviously a huge payoff, but there's loads of stories about Ted Bundy encounters that typically begin with, let me tell you a story about the time somebody almost got killed by Ted Bundy. Doesn't work as well. It's like telling the story I just told you. That story's been told many times across the internet and everywhere. But I bet some of you had no idea that was Ted Bundy until the very end. Think about just the discipline of, if you want a story to land, you start with the end. What am I going to reveal that I will not reveal until the end? And once you have that in mind, you build the story with as much discipline as you can to ensure nothing is tipped. And that includes even like stuff like if like you joked about this. If we tell a story that is on our channel and it's like, oh, Joey hopped on a boat to go on a fishing trip. You're like, oh, Joe's dead. Joe's going to die. It's like, understand, if you make content, understand that you might have tropes that you've created. You might have things that you do all the time that give away what happens.
We actually have a rule in the writer's room.
Do it, send it.
All bad smells are dead bodies. All boats sink. All planes crash.
It's true. And so I think it's really just about discipline. And I think, the way you sort of manage the writer's room is a testament to that.
Yeah, one of the most frequent edits I give is the writers they're anxious, they're impatient. We feel impatient. We're telling a story and the tension is getting to us too. And so you see people starting to like give away the ending too early, and it's like, nope, gotta hide it for one more beat.
This doesn't even pertain. It's just one of my favorite stories. I'm just going to tell it. It is a great ending. It's a great ending. This is, in my opinion, I'm setting myself up for failure potentially, but I think I'm good. I think it is one of the best endings, period, of any story I've covered. So there's this woman whose name is Ellie Lobel, and I'm sure some of you already know the story. Ellie Lobel was a woman who lived in California, who lives in California, I should say, and she came down with this mysterious illness. This is like in, I think it was like the early 2000s. And forgive me because I didn't prep the story. I'm just sort of telling it off my memory. So she comes down with this mysterious illness. And, she went to doctors left and right, and everybody was giving her different diagnoses, but no one knew what was wrong with her. But her illness was not something that it wasn't that extreme. It was like she was really tired. She was lethargic, she was sore, she was achy, she had flu-like symptoms. Periodically, her skin would, break out in rashes. But there wasn't anything that was so severe that she really took it to the next level and really demanded somebody figure out what was wrong with her. For years and years, she has this illness, and she's like this very high-powered person. Like, she's a lawyer, she's a mother, she's killing it in life. But on the backside, she's really struggling with this mystery illness. And over the course of it's like 15 years or something, and you got to forgive me because the details could be a little bit wrong, this condition got worse and worse to the point where, again, it's not really life-threatening. It's more like her quality of life was just shot. Like, she could barely get out of bed in the morning, like low energy. She didn't feel good. It's like something's wrong with her. No one knows what it is, but now she's just living with it. It is what it is. Well, she went in for a doctor's visit, this is 15 years into this saga. And also by this point, she had went through this horrible divorce with her husband. And it basically was over the fact that this is going to make him sound horrible. I don't know the guy, but it was like, you're not the woman I married. You're like a shell of yourself, because I think people thought she was lying, that like, whatever this is, what are you just tired all the time? Like, what's that about, right? So she goes through this horrible divorce. Her kids also apparently didn't really believe fully what was going on with her. And so she's living this like isolated life, and like the prestige and like the career success she had was sort of wiped by this mystery illness. She ends up going to the doctor. This is when she's like in her mid 40s. And this is like years and years into this, whatever this is. She's got no answers. And the doctors don't discover what's wrong with her. However, they do determine that whatever this is now actively killing you. Your organs are beginning to shut down. And unfortunately, we don't know what this is, but it is killing you. That's what's happening here, undeniably so. And Ellie's reaction actually was some level of relief. Her life to this point had become so far from what it was. She was so sad. She was so broken down physically, emotionally, mentally, that she actually sort of embraced this idea that finally it's going to end, whatever this is. And so she's given a prognosis, which I actually don't know how long it was, but it was relatively quick considering. It was like, let's say within a year or something. And, you know, her mentality after she's told you're going to die from this was she really allowed herself to shut down. She mentally really turned it off. In fact, she began looking into an end-of-life care person, somebody that doesn't try to resuscitate you, but who stays with you until you die. And so she actually did hire this end-of-life care person who she gave strict orders that when it's time to work together, when I'm in what I believe is going to be my final moments, I do not want you to save me. I just want you to help me stay comfortable and tell people when I die. That's your job. Like, she was really explicit about it. And so finally, it comes to the time where Ellie believes she's on death's door. You know, she didn't know for sure, but it felt like it was nearing the end. And so she actually rented an Airbnb out in Southern California, in this beautiful part of Southern California. Forget the name of the town, but it was like one of the places that she had loved growing up. And she's all alone. You know, her family doesn't even know that she's doing this. She's doing it to spare her family. But she rents this Airbnb, and the only person who goes there with her is this end-of-life care person. They go to the Airbnb, and literally, Ellie just gets into bed and waits to die. And that's it. She's not drinking anything. She's not eating anything. She thinks that she's going to die soon. She believes it. But after 3 days of that, she doesn't die. She's not doing good, but she hasn't died yet. And so she decides that she's just going to go on a quick walk. It's a beautiful summer day. And so she has her end-of-life care person come with her, and she leaves the Airbnb. She goes outside, and she just goes on this walk. And she passes by this beautiful pasture full of all these beautiful flowers. And she's just looking out over the fence of all this beauty, like the earth's natural beauty. And, you know, she's sad, but she's also like, this is a wonderful place to have my final moments. And as she's standing there, she hears a buzzing over her head. And she looks up and she sees there's a bee floating, like that's flying right above her head. And now she doesn't think much of it. There's flowers everywhere. That's where bees could be, you know. But quickly, a massive conglomerate of bees, a huge horde of, I don't know what the word is, a murder of bees. I think it's conglomerate.
501c3
it's an LLC of bees. So a 501c3 of bees shows up. And there's these bees that are flying around her head, but they're huge. They're these big African killer bees. And Ellie, by this point, is basically not immobile, but she can't move quickly. The bees come down and they begin stinging Ellie, like repeatedly in the face, and she can't go anywhere. And her end-of-life care person is like, nope, turns, runs away. And so Ellie has been left, and she literally collapses to the ground. She can't go anywhere, and she's getting stung over and over and over again by these bees. It is an onslaught. Eventually, the end-of-life care person has some humanity left, and they come back they run back, sorry, scoop her up, and they run her back to the house. And when she got to the house, she actually was sort of not relieved, because I'm sure she did not feel relieved, but she's thinking, great, this will expedite my expiration here. And so she tells the end-of-life care person, I don't want to go to the doctor. I don't want anything. Just put me back in bed. I want to die. And so Ellie Lobel, because this end-of-life care person is there to help her die, does just that, puts Ellie back in bed. And for 3 days, she laid in bed, and she didn't die. She actually got better. She actually got so much better that on the third day, she's swollen from all the bites, all the stings from the 501c3 of bees. That, you know, she's a very intelligent person. She's not thinking, oh, everything's fine. This has been like 20 years of problems in her life. So she gets up out of her bed after 3 days. She's like, something's going on here. And she begins to research, like, what could bee stings potentially help me in some way? And she discovers this totally obscure study in Australia from back in the 90s, where these scientists, they came up with a theory that if you had full-blown Lyme disease and you got stung by a whole bunch of bees, it might cure Lyme disease. The problem being they couldn't ever conduct the study because it was highly unethical to dump a 501c3 of bees on a terminally ill Lyme disease patient. But Ellie Lobel unintentionally conducted that study on herself, and she found out she had Lyme disease. That was what was killing her, and it cured her completely. She literally tours the country talking about the benefits of being stung by bees if you have Lyme disease. Her name is Ellie Lobel. It's fantastic. It's a crazy story. So yeah, that's that story. Pretty good. Pretty good.
Good story. Good story.
We're about to wrap up here. Any
We're about to wrap up, I think.
graphic novel? Why don't you talk about the
Graphic novel. Yes. So as so part of what we've been thinking about as we were preparing for this talk was just like the different how medium affects how you're telling a story, because it is different. Like it's actually Johnny tells the YouTube and he tells the podcast, but it's actually a completely different voice when you write podcast versus when you write YouTube. We have different writers for it. It's like an entirely different thing. And that's due to the medium. The podcast is actually, I think, a little easier to write for because you can't see Johnny, but YouTube, he's on camera, so it has to be like exactly his voice. But anyway, we were thinking about like, we also do graphic novels, and we have the second graphic novel coming out this fall. Yep. But you'll have an audiobook of the graphic novel, and I know we only have a second, but I know that when we did the first graphic novel, a lot of these were YouTube videos that we converted to graphic novels, which is like that's a big jump in writing. I mean, the YouTube scripts tend to run about 2,500 words or so. Graphic novel scripts much shorter because it's not very many words. But the pictures interact so beautifully with the script itself. We work with this really talented graphic novel writer, Rob Venditti, who's done like a ton of crazy things. But it's like watching him take your video and turn it into poetry. And that is not an exaggeration. He's very talented. But then you turned it into an audiobook. And I just wondered, I know that in the first one, you were surprised by how different the audiobook was from the graphic novel. And it's because, again, of the medium. So even though YouTube to graphic novel to audiobook, the audiobook winds up being different than the YouTube or the graphic novel. Yeah,
actually on that. So this is going to seem like a shameless plug because it is, but it's actually the truth, and I'll stand by this. So when we wrote, or really Evan and her team really put together the first graphic novel, which was a New York Times bestseller. Evan, great job.
Thank you.
It was my job to translate that into an audiobook. The easy approach would be to just read the words on the page and make it an audiobook, but I didn't do that. I don't know if you've listened to the audiobook for the first novel. It's pretty good. I'm going to be honest. I did a pretty good job. It's a whole performance, and I'm going to do it again for the second graphic novel, which is coming out this fall. The graphic novels are gorgeous. This one, I think, is better. The second one coming out this fall, it's called Where Nightmares Live, and there will be an audiobook component that you should totally go look for on Audible. Audible is the home of the best oral storytelling in the land, you know. There's conglomerates of Audible books you should listen to, and 501c3s of bees. So on that note, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Audible, for being here. And again, go check out Audible if you want to hear some cool storytelling. You guys are great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Huge thanks to Audible for sponsoring this episode. If you enjoyed this one, well, you are going to love diving into Audible's massive collection. From edge-of-your-seat true crime to mind-bending mysteries, they have thousands of titles that will grab you and not let you go. Listen today at audible.com/Mr. Ballen. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed today's episode, let us know down in the comments section. And also, if you enjoyed some of the stories that were told in this episode, be sure to check out our main YouTube channel called Mr. Ballen, where we have hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today. If you want a recommendation from me, I'd say this one's pretty good. Right here, click on this one, it's really good. All right, thank you very much. Until next time, see ya.